Hey there, truth seekers. Today we're tackling the question that keeps you up at 3 a.m. Are we alone in the universe? But here's the real kicker. What if the better question is, have we ever been alone? Ancient texts from cultures that never met tell eerily similar stories about people from the stars. Massive structures that make modern engineers scratch their heads. Astronomical knowledge that shouldn't exist for thousands of years. And artifacts that make scientists go, wait, how did they do that with bronze tools? So before we dive into this rabbit hole, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Because we're not talking tinfoil hats here. We're talking evidence. Physical, archaeological, textual evidence that's been sitting in museums while mainstream science does its best, nothing to see here impression. From the Dogon tribe knowing about invisible stars before telescopes, to chrome spheres in 17,000-year-old statues, to Sumerian texts describing genetic engineering, the pieces are all there. We just haven't been asking the right questions. So buckle up. By the end of this, you're either going to think I've lost my mind, or you're going to look at those pyramids a whole lot differently. Let's get into it. So here's where things get interesting, really interesting. We're about to talk about something that should absolutely not be possible if human civilization developed the way textbooks claim it did. Imagine this. You've got ancient cultures scattered across the planet. We're talking Mali in West Africa, the Hopi Mesas in what's now Arizona, fishing villages in Japan, mountain communities in Peru, and remote tribes in Australia. These people never met each other. They didn't have Zoom calls, they couldn't slide into each other's DMs, and they definitely weren't sharing notes on Reddit. Ocean barriers, mountain ranges, thousands of miles, and in many cases thousands of years separated them. They had zero contact with each other. Zero. And yet somehow, impossibly, they all tell the same story. People came from the sky. Beings descended from the stars. Teachers from the heavens brought knowledge, shared wisdom, and then, after doing whatever they came here to do, they left. They went back up there, promising to return someday. It's like the entire planet got the same script, but nobody bothered to tell mainstream archaeology. Which, unsurprisingly, has spent the last century insisting this is all just coincidence. Because apparently when dozens of unconnected cultures across 6 continents independently describe visitors from the cosmos with eerily similar details, that's just humans being creative. Sure, and I'm the King of England. Let's start with the Dogon people of Mali, because their story is absolutely wild and it makes scientists very uncomfortable. The Dogon have been living in the Bandiagara cliffs of Mali for centuries, practicing their traditions, passing down their oral histories from generation to generation. Nothing unusual there. Lots of cultures have rich oral traditions. But here's the kicker. The Dogon have detailed knowledge about the star system Sirius. Not just, oh look, bright star in the sky knowledge. Deep, technical, astronomical knowledge that they absolutely should not possess. They knew that Sirius has a companion star, Sirius B, which is invisible to the naked eye. They called it Potolo and described it as incredibly small, incredibly dense and incredibly heavy. They said it takes 50 years to orbit Sirius. They even drew diagrams of this orbital pattern. Now before you say, okay, maybe they had really good eyes, let me stop you right there. Sirius B was only confirmed by Western astronomy in 1862, when American telescope maker Alvan Clark spotted it. It wasn't photographed until 1970. This is a white dwarf star, the collapsed core of a dead star, that's roughly the size of Earth but has the mass of our Sun. You literally cannot see it without advanced telescopes. It's one of the densest objects in the known universe, and yet the Dogon, with 0 telescopes, 0 observatories, and 0 physics textbooks, knew about it. They described its properties with startling accuracy. They even knew it was white in colour. When anthropologists finally asked them, hey, how do you know all this? The Dogon didn't even hesitate. They said their ancestors were visited by the Nommo, amphibious beings who came from the Sirius star system in some kind of ark that descended from the sky with great noise and wind. The Nommo, they said, were sent to Earth to teach humanity. These beings shared astronomical knowledge, explained the structure of the cosmos, and basically gave the Dogon a celestial education that wouldn't be matched by Western science until the invention of powerful telescopes thousands of years later. The Dogon celebration of this event is still held every 50 years, coinciding with the orbital period of Sirius B. which they knew about, before telescopes. Let that sink in for a moment. Mainstream archaeology's response to this? Oh, they must have learned it from French astronomers who visited the area in the 1930s. Which is hilarious because the Dogon oral traditions about the Nommo and Sirius B date back at least 400 years, probably much longer. Also, French astronomers in the 1930s didn't know half the details about Sirius B that the Dogon described. The white dwarf characteristics, the extreme density, the precise orbital period. This information wasn't confirmed until decades after that supposed contact. So either the Dogon time travelled to a university library in 1970, or someone else told them. Someone who actually knew. Someone from, I don't know, maybe the Sirius star system. Let's hop over to the Hopi people of northeastern Arizona. The Hopi have oral traditions that speak of the star people or sky gods who came to Earth during what they call the First World and subsequent worlds. These beings were called the Kachinas, though that word has been somewhat misunderstood by modern culture. The Kachinas, according to Hopi tradition, were teachers who came from the stars, lived among the Hopi, taught them agriculture, astronomy, proper living, and spiritual practices. Then, after fulfilling their mission, they returned to the sky. The Hopi performed ceremonial dances wearing Kachina masks which, and this is where it gets visually interesting, look suspiciously like helmeted beings with large eyes and unusual headgear. Not exactly the kind of thing you'd expect from an isolated desert culture, unless they were drawing from something they'd actually seen. The Hopi also have detailed prophecies about these beings returning, including descriptions of signs in the sky, objects that fly without wings, and a time when the sky people would come back. Their rock art throughout the southwest depicts beings with antenna-like protrusions, circular helmets, and what appear to be breathing apparatus. Some of these petroglyphs are thousands of years old. Now you could argue, well, maybe they just had really creative imaginations, but here's the thing. Creativity usually looks different across cultures. If everyone's independently imagining the same thing, maybe it's not imagination. Maybe it's documentation. Speaking of documentation, let's talk about Japan. Specifically, let's talk about the Jomon period, which lasted from about 14,000 BC to 300 BC. The Jomon people created clay figurines called dog that are displayed in museums across Japan today. These aren't your typical ancient human representations. These are bizarre, alien-looking figures with enormous goggle-like eyes, strange suits that look like they have fastenings or closures, and helmets or headgear that cover their entire heads. Some of them appear to be wearing what look like ribbed suits or armor. The most famous one, the spaceman dog, looks like someone stuffed into a pressure suit. Now, the standard archaeological explanation is fertility symbols or shamanic representations, which is basically what archaeologists say when they have no idea what something is. Shamanic is the academic equivalent of because reasons. But if you actually look at these dog figures, they're not particularly fertility-focused. They're not obviously shamanic. They're just weird. They look like astronauts. Some of them have what appear to be goggles with slits or multiple lenses. Others have elaborate headpieces with decorative elements that serve no practical purpose, unless, of course, they're depicting actual equipment. The Jomon had oral traditions about kami who descended from the heavens to teach humanity. Kami is often translated as gods or spirits, but the original concept was more like beings of a higher plane, or those who come from above. The Jomon weren't technologically primitive either. They created some of the oldest pottery in the world, had complex settlements, and clearly had the artistic skill to reproduce what they saw. What they saw, apparently, were beings in suits with weird helmets. Now let's cross the Pacific to Peru. The Nazca culture, which flourished between 200 BC and 600 AD, left behind something that makes absolutely no sense from a ground perspective, the Nazca lines. These are massive geoglyphs, designs etched into the desert floor, that stretch for miles and can only be properly viewed from the air. There are geometric patterns, animals, humanoid figures, and shapes that look like landing strips. Some of these lines are perfectly straight for several miles, which is an impressive feat of engineering considering they didn't have surveying equipment or aerial views. Or did they? The Nazca mythology speaks of Viracocha, a sky god who came from the heavens, taught the people knowledge and skills, and then departed, promising to return. Similar stories exist throughout the Andes. The Inca had legends of the sons of the sun who descended in golden ships. The Tiwanaku culture near Lake Titicaca has traditions about star beings who built the megalithic city before humans inhabited the region. And here's what kills me. When Spanish conquistadors arrived and asked the Inca about structures like Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo, the Inca said, "We didn't build those." They said those structures were built by the gods, or by a previous, now gone. People who had knowledge the Inca didn't possess. The Inca, who built Machu Picchu, looked at these older structures and basically said, "Yeah, that's beyond us. Let that marinate. Let's go back across the ocean to the Pacific Islands." The Polynesian cultures spanning Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand, and countless other islands have creation myths that speak of beings who came from the Pleiades star cluster. They call them different names depending on the island. In Hawaii, they're connected to the Agua. In Maori tradition, they're related to the Atua. But the core story is the same. Beings from the Seven Sisters in the sky came down, lived among humans, shared knowledge, and then returned to the stars. The Polynesians were master navigators who could cross thousands of miles of open ocean using celestial navigation, which is impressive. But they claimed this knowledge was given to them by the star visitors. They didn't develop it themselves through trial and error. It was taught to them by beings who naturally knew quite a bit about celestial mechanics. Australia's Aboriginal people have some of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, with traditions dating back 50,000 years or more. And guess what? They also have stories about sky beings. The Wandjina, depicted in rock art throughout the Kimberley region, are shown as tall, white figures with large eyes, no mouths, and halos or helmets around their heads. These paintings are repainted by Aboriginal communities to this day, following precise traditional methods that have been passed down for thousands of years. The Wandjina, according to Aboriginal tradition, came from the sky during the dream time, created the landscape, brought laws and knowledge, and then returned to their home in the cosmos, where they watch over humanity. Some of these rock paintings are estimated to be over 4,000 years old, possibly much older. The Aboriginal people describe the Wandjina as powerful beings who could control the weather, create life, and travel through the sky. They say the Wandjina came in clouds, which could be poetic language or could be a description of atmospheric craft. The fact that these beings are consistently depicted without mouths is interesting. Various theories exist. Some say it represents their powerful unspoken authority. Others suggest it's because they communicated telepathically. Either way, it's a very specific artistic choice that appears nowhere else in Aboriginal art, which suggests it's depicting something particular about these beings, not just artistic style. Let's not forget the Americas. The Maya, known for their incredibly advanced astronomical knowledge and mathematics, have creation myths in the Popol Vuh that describe the sky gods, or lords of the sky, who came down to create humanity. According to their texts, humans were created after several failed attempts by these sky beings. First from mud, didn't work out, then from wood, also a disaster, and finally from maize, which apparently did the trick. The Maya built massive pyramid complexes precisely aligned with astronomical events, tracked Venus with startling accuracy, and had a calendar system that's more accurate than the Gregorian calendar we use today. They claimed this knowledge came from Kukulkan, the feathered serpent deity who descended from the heavens, taught civilization, and then flew back into the sky. The Aztecs had Quetzalcoatl, basically the same god with the same story, came from the stars, taught humanity, left, promised to return. The Toltecs before them had the same tradition. It's almost like this wasn't a myth, but a historical event that got passed down through successive cultures, each one remembering the visitors in their own way but maintaining the core narrative. Beings from the sky came, taught us stuff, left. What's fascinating is that these stories aren't just gods did things. They're surprisingly specific. The beings are described as physical entities. They arrived in craft or vehicles. They had technology, often described as magic, because how else would you describe advanced technology if you're an ancient culture? They taught specific skills: agriculture, astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, writing. Then they left, but they didn't just vanish. They went back up into the sky, back to the stars, back to wherever they came from. This is not typical myth structure. Most creation myths have gods creating the world from some primordial chaos, and then sticking around, setting up shop on a mountain or in the sky, and running things from there. But these accounts describe a different pattern: arrival, teaching, departure. That's not how myths usually work. That's how contact works. The Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia have perhaps the most detailed accounts of all. Their texts describe the Anunnaki, literally those who from heaven to earth came. The Sumerian king list, which chronicles the rulers of ancient Sumer, starts with kings who reigned for thousands of years each, and specifically states that kingship descended from heaven. After a great flood, sound familiar, the kingship was lowered from heaven again. The Sumerians didn't present this as metaphor or mythology. They presented it as history. Their administrative records, their astronomical texts, their mathematical tablets, all treat these events as factual occurrences. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki in remarkable detail. They were flesh and blood beings who could interbreed with humans, which is a very specific claim that has interesting genetic implications we'll get into later. They travelled in skyboats. They had weapons that could shoot fire and destroy mountains. They brought knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, law, and agriculture. They established the first cities. And according to these texts, they came to Earth to mine gold, needed workers to help with the mining, and either created or genetically modified humans to serve this purpose. It's a very transactional relationship when you read the actual texts. Not gods loved humanity and blessed them, but more, gods needed workers and made a workforce, which is weirdly pragmatic for a creation myth. The Egyptians have similar stories. The pre-dynastic period, the time before the pharaohs, is described in Egyptian texts as the era when the Neteru, the gods, ruled directly on earth. The Palermo stone and the Turin king list both reference divine rulers who preceded human pharaohs, some reigning for hundreds or thousands of years. The god Thoth, depicted as an ibis-headed figure, was said to have brought writing, mathematics, and astronomy to Egypt. The Egyptians didn't claim to have invented hieroglyphics themselves. They said Thoth gave it to them. Same with their astronomical knowledge, their medical knowledge, their architectural techniques. All gifts from the gods who came from the stars. The parallels are ridiculous, like statistically improbable levels of ridiculous. You've got cultures on different continents, separated by impossible distances, telling the same story with the same structure. Beings came from the sky. They were physical and real. They had advanced knowledge and technology. They taught humans. They interacted with humans, sometimes creating offspring, and then they left, going back to the stars. If one or two cultures had this story, fine, coincidence. But when it's dozens of cultures spanning every inhabited continent, all maintaining this narrative across thousands of years, calling it coincidence or collective imagination, starts to sound less like scholarship and more like denial. The standard academic response is that these are archetypes, that humans naturally create similar myths because we all look at the same sky and wonder about it. Which, okay, sure, humans do universalize certain experiences. But there's a difference between multiple cultures have flood myths because floods are a common traumatic event, and multiple cultures describe visitors from the Pleiades wearing helmets who taught astronomy and then flew away in skyships. One of those is a shared human experience. The other is a very specific, very detailed shared account of contact. There's also the inconvenient fact that many of these cultures were incredibly precise about which stars their visitors came from. The Dogons specified Sirius. The Polynesians specified the Pleiades. The Hopi have detailed star maps showing where the Kachinas originated. These aren't vague, somewhere up there gestures. These are astronomical coordinates. This is third star to the right and straight on till morning level specificity, except they're pointing at actual star systems that we've since confirmed could theoretically support planets in habitable zones. And before anyone says, well, they were probably just really interested in stars because they used them for navigation or agriculture, let me remind you that knowing a star exists is different from knowing it has an invisible companion star. Knowing the orbital period of that companion star, and knowing the physical properties of that companion star. That's not stargazing, that's insider information. The artistic representations across cultures are equally telling. You've got the Wandjina with their halos and large eyes in Australia. The dog figures in Japan with their goggle-like eyes and suits. Petroglyphs in Utah and New Mexico showing figures with antennae and helmets. The strange astronaut figures carved in temples across Central and South America. Rock art in the Sahara, yes, the Sahara, which used to be lush and green, showing round-headed figures with what appear to be suits. Val Camonica in Italy has rock carvings from 10,000 BC, showing figures with radiating halos or helmets and rectangular objects that look suspiciously like they're holding tools or devices. These images span tens of thousands of years and thousands of miles, Yet they share common visual elements that should not exist if these cultures were isolated and independent. Here's what really gets me. These cultures didn't depict their own people this way. Ancient Egyptian art shows Egyptians looking like Egyptians. Normal human proportions, normal heads, normal eyes. But then they show the Neteru, the gods, differently, often with animal heads or elongated skulls or unusual features. The Sumerians depicted themselves with realistic human proportions in their art, but the Anunnaki are shown as distinctly larger, with different facial features. It's like they were making a visual distinction. This is us, this is them. They weren't just being artistically creative, they were being documentarians. The linguistic evidence is equally compelling. Words for God in many ancient languages literally translate to those from the sky, or the shining ones, or those who descended. The Sumerian Dingir is written with a symbol that means shining, or from above. The Egyptian Nita relates to watcher, or observer, and is often written with a hieroglyph showing a staff or standard that some researchers interpret as a craft or vessel. The Hebrew Elohim, which is used in Genesis and is usually translated as God, is actually a plural word, gods, or mighty ones, and is used with plural verbs in several instances, suggesting multiple beings, not one deity. The ancient texts themselves are frustratingly specific in ways that mythology usually isn't. The Sumerian Enuma Elish doesn't say, "In the beginning, magic happened." It describes a scientific process. The creation of humans involves mixing the essence of a god with the clay of the earth, which sounds a lot like genetic material plus biological matter. The process fails multiple times before success, which is exactly what you'd expect from experimental genetic engineering, not divine magic which should work perfectly the first time. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Enkidu being created by the goddess Aruru, who mixes clay with spit, again, organic material plus biological fluid. These aren't vague, and then humans appeared myths. These are step-by-step procedural descriptions. Multiple cultures describe the visitors teaching specific technologies, not just general wisdom, but actual practical skills. The Sumerians credit the Anunnaki with teaching irrigation, agriculture, metallurgy, and writing. The Egyptians credit Thoth with medicine, mathematics, and engineering. The Maya credit Kukulkan with astronomy, calendrics, and architecture. The Chinese have legends of the Yellow Emperor who descended from the sky and taught metalworking, medicine, and writing. India's ancient Vedic texts describe the Vimana, flying craft used by the gods, in shocking technical detail, including propulsion systems, navigation, and even what sounds like defensive weaponry. The Vimanas, by the way, are described in texts like the Vaimanika Shastra, with the kind of detail you'd expect from an instruction manual, not mythology. There are passages describing how to make the craft invisible, how to listen to conversations in enemy aircraft, how to make the pilots appear as though they're wearing spacesuits. Wait, I'm sorry, what? Spacesuits? In ancient Indian texts. The text literally uses terms that translate to suit that protects from outer space, and describes pilots needing to wear special clothing to survive at high altitudes. This is either the most suspiciously accurate mythology ever written, or someone was describing actual technology they'd encountered. The global pattern isn't just in the stories, it's in the physical evidence too. Megalithic structures that shouldn't exist based on the technology available at the time appear on every continent. Pyramid structures specifically appear in Egypt, Sudan, Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, China, Bosnia, and Indonesia, among other places. These cultures supposedly never met, yet they all independently decided the best way to honor their gods was to build massive geometric structures aligned with astronomical events. Sure. Or maybe they were all following a template taught by the same teachers who came from the stars. The teaching aspect is crucial. These stories consistently describe the sky beings as educators, not conquerors. They don't come to enslave humanity. According to the myths, they come to uplift it. They share knowledge, establish civilizations, create laws, teach agriculture and astronomy. This is not typical deity behavior. Most mythological gods are capricious, emotional, violent, demanding worship and sacrifice. But these accounts describe something more like mentors or scientists running an educational program. They observe protocols, they have specific missions, they follow procedures. It's almost bureaucratic. The Anunnaki have a council. There's a chain of command. Decisions are made collectively. That's not how fictional gods usually operate. That's how an actual advanced civilization with administrative structures would operate. So what are we looking at here? Either human imagination is so universally consistent that cultures separated by 10,000 miles and 5,000 years all independently created the same elaborate fiction about star visitors with the same characteristics, same behavior. Patterns, same technology, same teaching mission, and same departure plans. Or, and here's the alternative that makes academics very uncomfortable, maybe it's not fiction. Maybe these cultures are all describing the same real events, filtered through their own cultural lenses and languages, but referring to actual contact with an actual non-human intelligence that visited Earth multiple times over the course of human history. The evidence isn't circumstantial anymore when it's this consistent, this widespread, and this detailed. This isn't a few scattered myths. This is a global phenomenon documented across every major civilization on every inhabited continent throughout human history. And the fact that mainstream academia keeps dismissing it with collective imagination or archetypal mythology is starting to look less like scholarship and more like willful blindness. Because here's the thing, if we're wrong and this is all just mythology, then fine. We've been investigating an interesting anthropological pattern. But if these cultures are right, if they're documenting actual historical contact with non-human intelligence, then we've been getting human history catastrophically wrong. We've been missing the biggest story in human existence because it doesn't fit the neat little narrative we've built about our species bootstrapping itself from cave paintings to civilization with no outside help. The global patterns aren't coincidences, they're not accidents, they're not collective imagination, they're evidence. And once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every continent, every major ancient culture, same story, same visitors, same message. We're not alone, we have never been alone, and someone out there knows a whole lot more about human history than we've been told. Alright, so we've established that cultures around the world tell suspiciously similar stories about visitors from the stars. But here's where it gets really uncomfortable for anyone who likes their human evolution nice and neat. Because there's a problem with how we became human. A big one. The kind of problem that makes evolutionary biologists do that thing where they adjust their glasses and say, well, it's complicated, and then change the subject. Let's talk about what happened roughly 200,000 years ago. Something bizarre occurred in human evolution. Something that shouldn't have happened, at least not as quickly as it did. Modern Homo sapiens appeared with a brain that was significantly larger and more complex than our immediate ancestors. We're not talking about a gradual, steady increase over millions of years like Darwin predicted. We're talking about a sudden leap that tripled brain capacity in what's basically an evolutionary eye blink. Now, before you say, well, evolution sometimes works in bursts, let me stop you right there. Yes, punctuated equilibrium is a thing. But even punctuated equilibrium doesn't usually work this fast, and it definitely doesn't skip this many steps. Here's what makes scientists scratch their heads. The fossil record shows our hominin ancestors chugging along with relatively small brains for millions of years. Australopithecus had a brain about the size of a chimp's, roughly 400 cubic centimeters. Homo habilis, around 2 million years ago, bumped that up to about 600 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus got to around 900 cubic centimeters. Nice, steady progress, right? The kind of gradual change you'd expect from natural selection doing its thing over vast time periods. Evolution taking its sweet time, as usual. Then, boom. Homo sapiens shows up with a brain averaging 1,400 cubic centimeters. That's not a gentle slope on the evolutionary chart, that's a vertical line. That's evolution going from a leisurely stroll to a sprint for no apparent reason. And here's the kicker. We don't have good transitional forms showing this progression. The intermediate steps that should exist if this was normal evolution, they're either missing or so sparse that it's like trying to understand a movie when you've only seen 3 random scenes. It's the evolutionary equivalent of watching someone go from riding a tricycle to piloting a fighter jet with nothing in between. Sure, it's technically possible, but you're definitely missing some crucial information about what happened in the middle. Modern evolutionary theory says this should have taken millions of years more than it did. The brain is metabolically expensive. It uses about 20% of our energy despite being only 2% of our body weight. That's like having a sports car engine in a sedan body. Evolution doesn't usually favour that kind of energy drain unless there's a really compelling reason. You need significant environmental pressure to justify that kind of biological investment. And here's where it gets weird. The environment wasn't changing dramatically enough to explain this leap. There wasn't some catastrophic climate shift or ecological disaster that would have required such a massive cognitive upgrade for survival. The environmental pressures during this period were actually relatively stable, so why did our brains suddenly balloon in size? The standard explanation is that increased meat consumption, social complexity and tool use created positive feedback loops that selected for larger brains. Which sounds plausible until you realize that our ancestors had been eating meat, living in social groups and using tools for millions of years before this leap. If that was the formula for big brains, why didn't it work earlier? Why did Homo erectus, who had fire, used tools, ate meat, and lived in complex social groups, hang out at 900 cubic centimeters for over 1,000,000 years, but then suddenly we jumped to 1,400? What changed? The meat didn't get meatier. The tools didn't get dramatically more complex overnight. Social groups didn't suddenly quadruple in size. Something else happened. Something that current evolutionary models don't adequately explain. Now let's talk about what makes modern humans really different. Not just bigger brains, but what we can do with them. Around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, something changed again. Archaeologists call it the Great Leap Forward or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Humans suddenly started producing art, jewelry, complex tools, elaborate burials, and showing evidence of symbolic thinking and abstract reasoning. This wasn't a gradual development. It happened relatively suddenly across multiple populations. It's like someone flipped a switch in the human brain and boom, we went from surviving to creating. From basic tool users to artists, musicians, and abstract thinkers. From getting through the day to wondering about the meaning of existence and painting it on cave walls. Here's where those Sumerian texts start sounding less like mythology and more like a lab report. The Enuma Elish and other Mesopotamian creation accounts describe the creation of humans in terms that are weirdly specific and scientific for what's supposed to be poetic mythology. The texts describe the Anunnaki deciding they need workers to help with mining operations, so they create humans. But, and this is the interesting part, they don't create humans successfully on the first try. The texts describe multiple failed attempts. The first versions don't work properly, they're defective, can't reproduce, can't function as intended, so the Anunnaki go back, adjust the process, try again. This happens several times. They're literally troubleshooting. One text describes the goddess Ninti, whose name literally means Lady of Life, or Lady who gives life, mixing the essence of a god with the clay of the earth to create humans. Now you could read essence as some magical divine substance, or you could read it as biological material, DNA, genetic code, whatever you want to call it. And clay of the earth could be poetic language for earthly biological matter, the existing hominin species that were already here. Mix divine essence with earthly matter, and you get humans. That's not creation from nothing. That's genetic engineering. That's taking an existing template and upgrading it. The text even describes the process as requiring multiple attempts with different combinations before achieving a viable result. The failed versions are described as beings who couldn't speak properly, couldn't reproduce, had physical defects. Then finally, after numerous trials, they get it right. They create humans who can think, speak, work, and reproduce. This is not how creation myths typically work. Most creation myths have an all-powerful deity who speaks and things happen perfectly. Boom, humans exist, moving on. But the Sumerian accounts read like lab notes, trial and error. Experimental iterations, quality control problems. Does that sound like omnipotent gods creating through divine will? Or does that sound like scientists running experiments with genetics they don't fully understand yet? The Epic of Atrahasis goes into even more detail. It describes the creation process involving the blood of a slain god mixed with clay, specifically mentioning mixing and binding, in ways that sound suspiciously like describing molecular processes. The text says humans were made from both divine and earthly elements combined. One interpretation: we're hybrids. Our DNA is partly from whatever was here naturally evolving on Earth, and partly from something else, something not from Earth. Which would explain why we evolved so much faster than we should have. We didn't evolve naturally. We were engineered. Modern genetics has actually discovered some weird stuff that lends credence to this idea. The Human Genome Project revealed that humans have about 223 genes that don't appear in any other known species on Earth. They're not in chimps, not in other primates, not in any evolutionary ancestor we can identify. These genes just show up in humans. Now, the standard explanation is horizontal gene transfer from bacteria, which does happen in evolution. But 223 genes is a lot to explain away with bacterial transfer. These aren't random junk genes either. Many of them are involved in important functions like brain development, immune response, and metabolism. It's almost like someone went through the human genome and added specific upgrades to specific systems. There's also the issue of chromosome 2. Humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Our closest relatives, chimpanzees, have 24 pairs. At some point in our past, 2 chromosomes fused together. We can see the evidence of this fusion. There are telomeres, chromosome end caps, in the middle of chromosome 2 where 2 chromosomes clearly merged. This fusion is unique to humans and happened relatively recently in evolutionary terms. Random mutations? Sure, possibly. Or maybe someone was tidying up the genetic code, streamlining the system. After all, if you're engineering a new species, you'd want to optimize the chromosome structure for efficiency. Then there's the FOXP2 gene, which is directly involved in speech and language capabilities. Humans have a specific variant of this gene that's different from other primates. This variant allows for the fine motor control of facial muscles necessary for complex speech. When scientists introduced the human version of FOXP2 into mice, yes, this is a real experiment, the mice showed changes in their vocalizations and their brain structure. One gene, massive effect on communication ability. Now, this gene could have evolved naturally through random mutation, but remember all those ancient texts talking about the gods giving the gift of speech to humans? The Sumerians said Enki, one of the Anunnaki, gave humans the ability to speak. The Egyptians said Thoth gave them language. Multiple cultures credit their sky gods with this specific ability. What if they weren't being metaphorical? What if they were describing actual genetic modification, someone literally giving us the genetic tools for complex language? The timing is suspicious too. Modern humans have been anatomically modern for about 200,000 years, but behaviorally modern for only about 50,000 to 70,000 years. There's a huge gap there. We had the hardware, the big brains, but we weren't using them to their full potential. Then suddenly, as if someone installed new software, we started creating art, developing complex language, thinking symbolically, making sophisticated tools, and generally acting like the humans we recognize today. What changed? Environmental pressures didn't change significantly during this period. The climate was actually relatively stable, so why the sudden cognitive revolution? Here's a thought. What if the 200,000-year mark was the hardware upgrade, the physical modification of our brains and bodies, but the cognitive revolution 50,000 to 70,000 years ago was the software update, the activation of latent capabilities? Or perhaps additional intervention? Maybe the visitors came back, saw that their creation needed further refinement and made adjustments. The texts do mention multiple contacts over time, not just one and done creation event. The Sumerian king list talks about divine rulers coming down, leaving, coming back, establishing things, leaving again. It's not a single intervention, it's ongoing involvement over long periods. The sudden appearance of symbolic thinking is particularly weird. Symbolism requires abstract reasoning, the ability to let one thing represent another thing. This isn't a survival skill you develop because you need to hunt better or avoid predators. This is high-level cognitive processing that serves no immediate evolutionary purpose. Why would natural selection favor the ability to create art or music when those skills don't help you survive? Unless, of course, you were designed with these capabilities for a purpose that goes beyond basic survival. What if symbolic thinking, creativity, and abstract reasoning were intentional features, not accidental byproducts? Let's talk about the Rh negative blood type, because this is where things get really strange. Most humans are Rh positive, meaning they have a specific protein on their red blood cells inherited from rhesus monkeys, our evolutionary ancestors. But about 15% of the population, concentrated heavily in Europe and the Middle East, are Rh negative. They don't have this protein. Now, in normal evolution, this should have been selected out. When an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive baby, her body can treat the baby as a foreign invader and attack it. This is called Rh incompatibility, and without modern medical intervention, it often results in miscarriage or stillbirth. Evolution should have eliminated Rh-negative blood because it creates reproductive problems, yet it persists, and in some populations at very high frequencies. Why? Some researchers have proposed that Rh-negative blood represents a mutation, but it's a mutation that causes reproductive difficulties and should have disappeared. Others have suggested that it's a remnant from an isolated population, but that doesn't explain why it's concentrated in specific regions that happen to be the cradles of ancient civilizations. And here's where it gets tinfoil hat levels of interesting. People with Rh-negative blood have slightly different characteristics. They tend to have lower body temperature, higher blood pressure, and often report unusual sensitivities. Some studies, controversial ones admittedly, suggest subtle differences in brain structure and function. It's almost like Rh-negative individuals are a slightly different variant. Not dramatically different, but measurably different. Different enough that in ancient terms they might have been considered partially divine, partially other. Many ancient royal bloodlines emphasized Rh-negative blood, calling it blue blood or divine blood. Were they onto something? The Basque people of Spain and France have the highest concentration of Rh-negative blood in the world, up to 35%. They also have a language that's unrelated to any other language on Earth. It's a linguistic isolate with no known relatives. Their origin is mysterious, their genetics are unusual, and their culture has ancient traditions of coming from elsewhere. Just saying, that's a lot of anomalies for one population. Either the Basque are the luckiest recipients of random mutations in history, or there's something about their ancestry that's different from standard human evolution. Then we have the issue of human genetic diversity, or rather, the lack of it. Compared to other species, humans are remarkably genetically homogeneous. Chimps have more genetic diversity in one forest in Africa than humans have across the entire planet. This suggests a population bottleneck, a point where the human population crashed to very small numbers and then rebounded. Geneticists call this the Toba catastrophe theory, linked to a supervolcano eruption around 70,000 years ago. The theory suggests human population dropped to maybe 10,000 individuals or fewer. Survival of the fittest, right? Except here's the weird part. We didn't just survive that bottleneck, we thrived immediately afterward. The cognitive revolution happened right after this supposed near-extinction event. Our population didn't just recover, it exploded. We spread across the planet rapidly and started dominating every ecosystem we encountered. That's not typical bottleneck behavior. Usually species that survive bottlenecks take a long time to recover and are often weaker for it. But humans came out of this bottleneck and immediately went into expansion mode with upgraded cognitive capabilities. It's almost like that bottleneck was intentional. Like someone selected a specific population, made modifications, and then that modified population spread out and replaced the unmodified populations, which is exactly what the genetic evidence shows, by the way. Modern humans spread out of Africa and replaced other hominin populations with very little interbreeding, just enough to leave traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, but not enough to suggest peaceful integration. It was more like a replacement event, a rollout of the new model. The ancient texts describe this too. The Atrahasis epic talks about the Anunnaki becoming frustrated with humans and deciding to reduce the population through a flood. Only specific humans, those who were chosen, survived. Then those survivors repopulated the earth. The biblical flood narrative has the same structure. Selection of specific individuals, Noah's family, destruction of the rest, repopulation from the survivors. The flood myths appear in cultures worldwide: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Native American. All describe a catastrophic flood that killed most of humanity, with only a select few surviving to restart civilization. What if this isn't mythology? What if it's a cultural memory of an actual population bottleneck, possibly even an intentional one? Here's what really gets me. The Sumerian texts describe the creation of humans as a deliberate project with a specific purpose. Humans weren't created because the gods loved us or wanted companionship. We were created as a workforce. The Anunnaki needed laborers to mine gold and perform other tasks, so they engineered a species intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, but not so intelligent as to be a threat. They created us as a servant species, which, if true, is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It means we weren't the pinnacle of creation, We were the help. We were the universe's labor force, designed and deployed by a more advanced civilization for their purposes. But here's the interesting part. The texts also describe some of the Anunnaki taking pity on humans and giving us additional knowledge and capabilities beyond our original programming. Enki, in particular, is portrayed as humanity's advocate, teaching us things we weren't supposed to know, giving us abilities beyond our intended function. The story of Adapa describes a human who was given wisdom by Enki, making him almost as knowledgeable as the gods themselves, which caused conflict among the Anunnaki. It's like someone on the engineering team went rogue and started upgrading the product beyond specifications, and maybe that's why we have capabilities, art, music, philosophy, abstract thought, that serve no obvious survival purpose. Maybe those are the unauthorized features, the bonus content, the stuff we weren't supposed to have but got anyway because one of our creators felt generous or rebellious. The double helix structure of DNA itself appears in ancient art in ways that shouldn't be possible. Sumerian cylinder seals show intertwined serpents or vines in a double helix pattern. The staff of Hermes, the caduceus, features two serpents wound around a central staff in a helical pattern. Literally the structure of DNA depicted thousands of years before Watson and Crick. The ancient Indians described the Kundalini as a coiled serpent of energy in the spine, depicted as intertwined channels in a helical pattern. Were these symbolic representations of energy and life force, or were they depicting actual knowledge of genetic structure? Because if you're an ancient culture trying to represent the code of life without having words for molecules and chromosomes, showing two intertwined serpents or vines is a pretty good way to do it. The evidence keeps stacking up. The sudden evolutionary leaps, the missing transitional forms, the genetic anomalies, the ancient texts describing genetic engineering in procedural detail, the appearance of capabilities that serve no obvious survival function, the population bottlenecks followed by rapid expansion and cognitive upgrades, the DNA symbolism in ancient art. All of this could be coincidence. All of this could have natural explanations that just happen to align suspiciously with the ancient accounts of genetic intervention. Or, and here's the uncomfortable possibility, maybe the ancient texts aren't mythology, maybe they're history. Maybe someone really did engineer us, upgrade us, modify us to be more than we were naturally evolving to be. And if that's true, then we're not just another species that happened to evolve intelligence through the random chance of natural selection. We're a designed species, a project, the product of intentional intervention by something with knowledge of genetics far beyond what should have existed in ancient times. We're not the accident, we're the experiment. And based on how quickly we went from cave paintings to smartphones, I'd say the experiment worked pretty well, maybe too well, depending on who you ask. The question isn't really, did evolution happen? Of course it did. The question is whether evolution was the only thing that happened, or whether someone gave evolution a very significant helping hand, multiple times, to push us from smart apes to the species that builds rockets and debates philosophy. And if that intervention happened, what was the purpose? Why bother? What were they trying to create? And perhaps most importantly, are they satisfied with the results, or are we still a work in progress? Because if we're a work in progress, that would suggest the project isn't finished. It would suggest they might come back, to check on us, to upgrade us again. Or possibly to decide we didn't turn out as planned and it's time to start over with a better model. So we've talked about the stories, we've talked about the genetics, but here's where skeptics usually dig in their heels and say, okay, but where's the physical evidence? Fair question. Because stories can be exaggerated, memories can be distorted, and genetics can be interpreted in multiple ways. But physical objects, those are harder to explain away. Those are the things you can touch, test, photograph, and put in museums where they sit quietly making archaeologists uncomfortable. So let's talk about the stuff that shouldn't exist, the objects and artifacts that don't fit anywhere in our neat timeline of human technological development, and make scientists do that thing where they quietly shelf something and hope nobody asks too. Many questions about it. Let's start with the sky stones of Sierra Leone, because these things are genuinely bizarre. In the 1990s, strange blue-black stones started appearing in Sierra Leone, West Africa. Local people called them sky stones and had legends claiming they fell from the heavens. Now, usually when you hear stones from the sky, you think meteorites, right? Space rocks. We know those exist. We have whole collections of them. They're mostly iron and nickel, they have specific characteristics, and they're relatively easy to identify. These are not those. These sky stones are something else entirely. They're blue, which is already unusual. They're incredibly hard, harder than granite, and when you try to cut them or break them, they reveal even weirder properties. The interior sometimes contains white veins or structures that don't match any known geological formation. Multiple laboratories have tested these stones, and by multiple, I mean at least 12 different scientific institutions have examined samples and basically shrugged. They can't definitively identify the composition. The stones contain oxygen and carbon, but in ratios that don't match known minerals. Some tests suggest they might be artificial, as in manufactured. But manufactured by whom? With what technology? And when? Because if these are artificial, we're talking about materials engineering capabilities that we only recently achieved. The stone's hardness and unique crystalline structure would require high-temperature processing and precision manufacturing. Not exactly something you whip up in a Bronze Age workshop. Even today, creating synthetic materials with these properties requires sophisticated equipment and controlled environments. Yet here they are, scattered across West Africa, with local traditions saying they fell from the sky thousands of years ago. The Sierra Leone government has been pretty quiet about the sky stones, probably because saying we have mysterious, possibly artificial stones that might be from space or might be from ancient super-advanced civilization doesn't exactly inspire confidence in your archaeological credibility. A few samples have made it to international researchers, but comprehensive studies are limited. What we do know is that these stones exist. They're anomalous. They don't match known geological or meteoritic classifications, and they might be manufactured objects. Which raises the obvious question, if someone manufactured precision-engineered stones thousands of years ago, who was it? Because it certainly wasn't the local Bronze Age population working with copper tools and clay pottery. Now let's talk about the Klerksdorp spheres from South Africa, because these are even weirder. Miners in South Africa have been finding these things for decades in pyrophyllite deposits that date back 2.8 billion years. Yes, billion with a B. These are near-perfect spheres with 3 parallel grooves running around their equators. They range from about 1 to 4 inches in diameter. They're made of either a hard, reddish-brown material or a softer, bluish metal. And here's the kicker. Some of them are hollow. Inside these hollow spheres is a spongy material that disintegrates when exposed to air, which is wild because the sphere itself is sitting in rock that's billions of years old. Now, the official explanation is that these are naturally occurring mineral concretions formed through geological processes, which would be fine, except natural concretions aren't usually this perfectly spherical. They don't typically have precisely parallel grooves carved into them, and they definitely don't form inside 2.8 billion-year-old rock and then turn out to be hollow with weird internal structures. The spheres are so perfectly round that they've been balanced on flat surfaces and measured for rotation, and they spin with minimal friction for extended periods. That's not typical of natural rock formations, which are generally irregular and unbalanced. These things look machined. They look like someone made them. The grooves are particularly troubling for the natural formation theory. They're parallel, evenly spaced, and consistent across multiple specimens. Natural weathering doesn't work that way. Natural erosion creates random patterns, not precision parallel lines. If you showed these spheres to any engineer without context, they'd assume they were manufactured parts from some kind of machinery. Ball bearings, maybe, or precision-fitted components. But they're sitting in rock that predates complex life on Earth by billions of years, long before dinosaurs, before fish, before even bacteria had figured out how to photosynthesize. Just sitting there, perfectly spherical, grooved, and hollow in impossibly old rock. The South African authorities have examined these spheres and basically punted on explaining them. Museums display them as natural curiosities. But talk to the miners who find them, and they'll tell you these things are everywhere in certain deposits. They're consistently spherical, and they definitely look manufactured. Some researchers have proposed they're evidence of pre-human technological civilizations on Earth. Others suggest they're artifacts from ancient alien mining operations, which, given that South Africa has some of the world's richest mineral deposits, and those Sumerian texts specifically mentioned the Anunnaki mining gold in Africa, is at least thematically consistent. Either way, they shouldn't exist. Not looking like that. Not in rock that old. Let's hop over to Italy and talk about Val Camonica, because the rock art there is absolutely wild. Val Camonica is home to over 200,000 petroglyphs spanning thousands of years, Most of them are pretty standard ancient rock art. Hunters, animals, daily life scenes, the usual stuff you'd expect. But mixed in with the normal depictions are figures that look, for lack of a better word, like astronauts. We're talking about beings with large rounded helmets, rectangular bodies that appear to be wearing suits, and what look like antennae or breathing apparatus protruding from their heads. These aren't stylized human figures. They're distinct and different from the clearly human figures depicted in the same area. The most famous of these is what researchers call the astronauts of Valcamonica, two figures that look like they're wearing spacesuits with helmets that have radiating lines around them, like halos or perhaps representations of illumination. They're holding what appear to be tools or implements. Their body proportions are different from the human figures shown nearby. And this isn't one isolated weird carving. It's multiple figures across multiple locations in the valley, all depicting similar characteristics. The carvings date back to roughly 10,000 BC, making them among the oldest known rock art in Europe. So we're supposed to believe that Paleolithic hunters, living in caves and chasing mammoths with stone-tipped spears, just happened to imagine beings in protective suits with helmets and tools that look suspiciously like modern depictions of astronauts? Sure, and I'm sure they also independently invented science fiction and just never got around to writing it down. The local academic explanation is that these represent shamanic figures or spiritual beings, which is archaeology's go-to answer for, we have no idea what this is. Whenever ancient art doesn't make sense, it's shamanic, it's ritual, it's symbolic. Never mind that the Valcamonica people carved very realistic images of deer, hunters, and daily life. Clearly they were capable of realistic representation. But when they carved the astronauts, suddenly they switched to symbolic abstraction. Or maybe, and here's a wild thought, they were depicting what they saw, and what they saw were beings in suits with helmets, and they carved it as accurately as their artistic skills allowed. Speaking of mysterious spheres, we need to talk about Costa Rica's stone spheres. These are hundreds of perfectly spherical stones scattered across Costa Rica, some weighing up to 15 tons, with diameters up to 2 meters. They were created by the Dickies culture between 700 and 1500 AD. The stones are made of gabbro, a hard igneous rock, and they're polished to near-perfect spherical dimensions. When modern researchers measured them with precision instruments, some were accurate to within centimeters of perfect spheres. That's impressive craftsmanship for a culture working with stone tools and no written records of their techniques. The stones were originally found in perfect geometric arrangements, alignments that pointed to magnetic north, and in some cases mirrored astronomical patterns. Unfortunately, after their discovery in the 1930s, many were moved by companies clearing land for banana plantations, destroying the original layouts. We lost crucial contextual information about what these arrangements meant. But what remains clear is that someone put enormous effort into creating these perfect spheres and arranging them in meaningful patterns. The labour required would have been massive, quarrying multi-ton boulders, transporting them to specific locations, and then somehow shaping them into precision spheres using supposedly primitive tools. The local legends about these spheres claim they were made by gods or by ancient people who knew the secrets of stone and could soften rock, making it malleable like clay. Which sounds like mythology, until you consider that no one has successfully replicated the precision of these spheres using the tools available to the Dickies culture. Modern attempts with stone tools produce lumpy approximations, not precision spheres. It's possible the Dickies had advanced techniques we haven't rediscovered. Or, following the theme we've been building, maybe they had help. Maybe someone taught them. Someone who knew advanced stoneworking techniques that we're still trying to figure out. The Baghdad battery is another artifact that makes zero sense. Discovered near Baghdad in 1936, it's a clay jar containing a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod. When filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, it produces about 1 to 2 volts of electricity. It dates to the Parthian Empire, somewhere between 150 BC and 650 AD. Now, the standard explanation is that it might have been used for electroplating, using electrical current to coat objects with thin layers of metal. Which is plausible, except there's no other evidence of electroplating in Parthian culture. No electroplated objects, no written records of the technique, no other batteries. Just this one jar that happens to function as a primitive electrical cell, sitting in a museum making people ask uncomfortable questions. Some researchers dismiss it as a scroll holder or a storage vessel that happens to have these components. But the design is very specific. The copper cylinder is sealed at the bottom with asphalt, the iron rod is suspended in the center without touching the sides, and the whole assembly is clearly intentional, not random. Someone designed this to function as a battery. Someone in ancient Mesopotamia understood electrochemical reactions and created a device to generate electricity. Either they figured this out independently through experimentation, which is possible but leaves us wondering why the technology didn't spread or develop further, or they learned it from someone who already knew. Someone who perhaps gave them just enough knowledge to create specific tools without giving them the full theoretical framework to understand or advance the technology. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a shipwreck off Greece and dating to around 100 BC, is another case of this shouldn't exist. It's a bronze-geared device that functions as an astronomical calculator, predicting the positions of the sun, moon and planets as well as eclipse cycles. When it was discovered in 1901, it was so complex that researchers initially thought it was from medieval times and had somehow ended up in an ancient shipwreck. Then they dated it and realized it was 2,000 years old. The mechanism has over 30 bronze gears in a sophisticated arrangement, with a precision of manufacture that wasn't seen again until the 14th century. It's basically an ancient analog computer. Now, we know the Greeks were mathematically sophisticated. They understood astronomy, geometry, and mechanics. So in theory, they could have built this. But here's the problem. We have no record of them building anything like it. No similar devices, no descriptions in texts, no evidence of the technological development that should have led up to such a complex creation. It's like finding a smartphone in medieval France. Sure, in theory, if you gave a medieval craftsman all the knowledge and materials, they might be able to assemble something similar. But where did that knowledge come from? How did they leap from basic sundials to precision-geared astronomical calculators with no intermediate steps? The Antikythera mechanism represents a level of technological sophistication that seems disconnected from the rest of Greek technology of that era. It's an outlier, an anomaly, the kind of thing that makes you wonder if maybe someone showed them how to build it. Then we have the crystal skulls, which are controversial but worth mentioning. These are skull-shaped carvings made from solid blocks of quartz crystal, some with remarkable precision and detail. The most famous is the Mitchell-Hedges skull, allegedly found in Belize in the 1920s. It's carved from a single piece of clear quartz, perfectly proportioned, with a detachable jaw. When examined under microscopes, researchers found no tool marks. The crystal appears to have been shaped and polished without leaving the scratches or abrasions that carving tools would create. Quartz is incredibly hard, rating a 7 on the Mohs scale. Working it requires either patience that borders on inhuman or technology that can shape and polish crystal without leaving marks. Now, some of the crystal skulls have been debunked as 19th century forgeries made with modern tools. But others remain unexplained. The technology required to carve and polish quartz to that precision, especially the internal details and optical properties some skulls display, would require advanced knowledge of crystallography and lapidary techniques. Could ancient people have done it? Maybe, given enough time and skill, but the precision suggests knowledge of crystal structure and optics that we associate with modern gemology, not ancient craftsmanship. And again, the local legends claim these skulls held power, contained knowledge, and were gifts from the gods, not made by locals, but given to them, which is a recurring theme at this point. The Coso artifact found in California in 1961 is another weird one. Fossil hunters found what appeared to be a geode, a rock with crystal formations inside. When they cut it open, they found a metallic object that looked like a spark plug or some kind of electrical component, encased in solid rock that was supposedly 500,000 years old. Now, the dating has been disputed, and some researchers believe the rock wasn't actually that old, and the object is simply a 1920s spark plug that got encased in fast-forming concretion, which is the reasonable, sensible explanation. But if the original dating was correct, if this really was a manufactured object in half-million-year-old rock, then we've got a problem, because humans weren't making spark plugs or anything similar 500,000 years ago. We weren't making anything. We were barely using fire. The problem with anomalous artifacts is that they're often dismissed individually. Each one can be explained away as a hoax, a misidentification, a natural formation, or an object that's incorrectly dated. And individually, yeah, skepticism is warranted. But when you stack them up, the spheres, the stones, the carvings, the technological artifacts, the precision-machined objects in impossibly old rock, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. It's death by 1,000 cuts for the standard archaeological narrative. Each anomaly is a cut. Individually, they're not fatal, but collectively. They suggest something's not right with our understanding of ancient history and the technological capabilities available to ancient peoples. What really gets me is the response from mainstream archaeology. Instead of curiosity, there's dismissal. Instead of investigation, there's shelving. Anomalous artifacts get labelled as hoaxes or oddities and then forgotten, filed away in storage where they don't threaten the established timeline. Museums display them as curiosities without context, or they don't display them at all. Papers get published questioning their authenticity without actually testing them comprehensively. It's like the entire field has decided that anything that doesn't fit the narrative must be wrong, rather than considering that maybe the narrative needs updating. And look, I get it. If you're an archaeologist who spent your career building theories on the assumption that ancient people had limited technology and developed in a slow, linear progression the existence of precision-machined spheres in billion-year-old rock or electrical batteries in Parthian Mesopotamia is deeply inconvenient. It suggests either your timeline is wrong or something else was happening that you haven't accounted for. Neither option is great for your academic reputation. So the safer bet is to dismiss, ignore, or reinterpret these artifacts until they fit the existing framework. Label them natural formations, ritual objects, or hoaxes, and move on. But the artifacts don't go away. The sky stones are still there. The Klerksdorp spheres are still being found. The Valcamonica astronauts are still carved into rock. The Baghdad battery still generates electricity when you fill it with vinegar. These things exist. They're real. They're measurable, testable, physical objects that don't make sense in the context we've been given. And the more you look at them, the more they seem to point to the same conclusion. Either ancient people were far more technologically capable than we give them credit for, which raises the question of why that technology disappeared, or they had access to knowledge and tools from somewhere else. From someone else. From the same visitors described in all those global myths we talked about earlier. The physical evidence supports the stories. The stories explain the evidence. When a culture says the gods from the sky taught us to work with stone and metal, and then you find precision stone spheres and electrical batteries in that culture's archaeological layers, maybe, just maybe, you should consider that they're not being metaphorical. Maybe they're telling you exactly what happened. Someone came, someone taught, someone left artifacts behind. Not grand monuments necessarily, but tools, components, objects that demonstrate technological knowledge that shouldn't exist in that time period. Gifts, perhaps, or leftovers, or test items. The experimental results of seeing how much technology could be transferred to a developing species. And if you're still skeptical, that's fine. Skepticism is healthy. But ask yourself this. If an advanced civilization did visit Earth in ancient times, what would they leave behind? Probably not massive neon signs saying aliens were here. They'd leave exactly what we're finding. Small artifacts, precision objects, technological anomalies scattered across the planet, embedded in ancient layers, sitting in museums labelled as curiosities while archaeologists scratch their heads and mutter about ritual purposes. They'd leave the kind of evidence that's easy to dismiss individually but hard to ignore collectively. They'd leave exactly what we've been talking about. The sky stones, the spheres, the carvings, the artifacts, they're not proof. But they're evidence, they're pieces of a puzzle. And when you combine them with the stories, the genetic anomalies, the astronomical knowledge, and the architectural achievements we'll talk about later, the picture becomes clearer. We've had visitors. They left traces, both in our DNA and in physical objects scattered across the planet. The question isn't whether the evidence exists, it does. The question is whether we're brave enough to accept what it's telling us. We've covered the physical evidence, the genetic anomalies, the global patterns, but now let's talk about something we use every single day without thinking about how weird it is. Language. Specifically, how we got it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that linguists don't like to advertise. We have no idea how human language evolved. We have theories, sure, lots of theories. But the fossil record doesn't preserve speech. Brain structure tells us surprisingly little about language capability. and the transition from grunts and gestures to complex syntax happened so fast that it basically looks like someone flipped a switch. And before you say, well, evolution can work quickly, let me remind you that complex language requires coordinated changes in brain structure, vocal tract anatomy, neural pathways, and cognitive processing. That's not one mutation. That's a whole system overhaul, the kind of thing that should take millions of years, not thousands. Let's start with what we know, or rather, what we don't know. Modern humans have been anatomically capable of speech for at least 200,000 years. We have the right vocal tract, the right tongue, the right larynx position, all the hardware is there. But evidence of complex language use, symbolic thinking, abstract communication, art, notation systems, doesn't show up until around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. That's a gap of 150,000 years where we had the equipment but apparently weren't using it. It's like buying a Ferrari and using it as a planter for 150 millennia before someone finally says, hey, I think this thing might go fast if we turn it on. What were we doing for all that time? Why did it take so long to start using capabilities we already possessed? The standard explanation is that language evolved gradually over millions of years from simple calls and gestures used by our primate ancestors. Which sounds reasonable until you look at actual primate communication and realize it's nothing like human language. Chimps can learn hundreds of signs. They can communicate basic needs, emotions, and simple concepts, but they can't do syntax. They can't create novel sentences following grammatical rules. They can't discuss abstract concepts or things that aren't immediately present. They're stuck in the here and now, communicating about what they can see, touch, or feel right this second. Human language is fundamentally different. We can talk about things that happened yesterday, things that might happen tomorrow, things that never happened but could theoretically happen in an alternate universe. We can discuss philosophy, mathematics, hypothetical scenarios, and whether a hot dog is a sandwich. That's not just more advanced communication, that's a completely different type of cognition. The gap between primate communication and human language is massive, like Grand Canyon massive, and we don't have good evidence of intermediate stages. You'd expect to find populations with simple proto-languages, basic syntax, limited vocabulary. But we don't. Languages are either fully complex or they're just communication systems without grammar. There's no middle ground. Every human language, from the most isolated tribes to modern urban societies, has complex grammar, recursive structures, and the ability to generate infinite novel sentences from finite rules. A 3-year-old child can create grammatically correct sentences they've never heard before by intuitively understanding structural rules they can't consciously articulate. That's not learned behavior, that's hardwired capability. And it's universal across all human populations, which suggests it's genetic, not cultural. Noam Chomsky famously argued that humans have an innate universal grammar, a built-in language acquisition device in the brain that allows children to learn any language they're exposed to with minimal effort. Kids don't need formal instruction. They just absorb language from their environment and automatically figure out the rules. This suggests language capability is biological, not just cultural. But here's the problem. If language is genetic, where's the evolutionary pathway? How did this complex system evolve? And why don't other species show even partial development of similar systems? If language evolved gradually through natural selection, you'd expect to see some evidence of intermediate stages in other species or in the fossil record. You'd expect some primates to have simple grammar, some to have more complex grammar, building up to human levels, but they don't. The gap is total. Now let's talk about what ancient cultures said about where language came from. Because surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly at this point, they all tell the same story. Language was a gift. Not something humans developed on their own, but something given to us by the gods, the sky people, the teachers from above. The Sumerians credited Enki with giving humans the ability to speak. The Egyptians said Thoth invented language and writing and taught them to humanity. The Maya attributed speech and writing to the gods who created humans. The Aztecs said Quetzalcoatl gave them language. Hindu texts describe the goddess Saraswati as the giver of speech and knowledge. Greek mythology credits Hermes with inventing language. The biblical account has God directly giving Adam language. Adam can immediately name animals, which requires both vocabulary and conceptual categorization. In the Quran, Allah teaches Adam the names of all things, Notice the pattern? Across cultures, across continents, across thousands of years, the story is consistent. Humans didn't invent language. We received it. It was taught to us, given to us, installed in us. Now you could say this is just how primitive people explained natural phenomena they didn't understand. They attributed everything to gods. Except these cultures had no problem taking credit for things they actually invented. They proudly described their innovations in agriculture, pottery, architecture, navigation. They claimed ownership of their cultural achievements, but language, that they universally attributed to divine intervention. Why? Maybe because they had cultural memory of a time before complex language, and they remembered, however dimly through oral tradition, that something changed. Something was given to them. Someone taught them. The Tower of Babel story is particularly interesting. According to Genesis, humanity originally spoke one language. Everyone understood everyone else. They started building a tower to reach heaven, which, depending on how you interpret it, could mean a literal tower, or could symbolize technological advancement that the gods found threatening. So God confused their language, creating multiple languages so they couldn't understand each other and couldn't cooperate on large-scale projects. Now, standard interpretation is that this is just a myth explaining linguistic diversity. But what if it's describing an actual event? What if there was a time when humans had unified language, perhaps given to them or installed in them, and then that language was intentionally diversified? It sounds wild, but it would explain why languages are so systematically different yet structurally similar. They all follow the same deep grammatical principles, Chomsky's universal grammar, but with different surface implementations. Almost like they were versions of the same software running on the same hardware with different user interfaces. Modern linguistics has discovered something weird. All human languages share certain structural similarities despite being completely unrelated. They all have nouns and verbs. They all have ways of indicating tense, aspect, and mood. They all have recursive structures allowing sentences within sentences. They all follow specific constraints on word order and grammatical relationships. These aren't learned similarities. They're built into how human brains process language, which suggests language isn't just cultural but biological. And if it's biological and appeared suddenly without clear evolutionary precursors, well, that points to either a miraculous mutation, which is what standard evolution would require, or intentional design. Someone installing language capability into the human brain. Let's talk about the FOXP2 gene again, because it's crucial here. This gene affects the development of brain regions involved in speech and language. Mutations in FOXP2 cause severe speech and language disorders. The human version of this gene differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acids, but those 2 changes have massive effects. They influence the development of neural pathways necessary for complex speech. This gene didn't just randomly mutate, it's under strong positive selection, meaning evolution actively favored it. But here's the kicker. Those specific mutations appear to have become fixed in the human population relatively recently, sometime within the last 200,000 years. That's suspiciously close to the time when anatomically modern humans appeared. It's also suspiciously close to when Sumerian texts say the Anunnaki created humans. Just throwing that out there. When scientists introduced the human version of FOXP2 into mice, the mice showed altered vocalizations and changes in brain structure, particularly in areas related to learning and motor control. One gene, massive functional changes. This isn't gradual evolution tinkering with multiple systems over millions of years. This is targeted modification of a specific gene that controls language-related development. If you were genetically engineering a species to be capable of complex language, FOXP2 is exactly the kind of gene you'd target. And if you were documenting that engineering process in texts, you might describe it as giving the gift of speech, or teaching the names of things. You'd frame it in terms your culture could understand, divine gifts from powerful beings, because you don't have the vocabulary for genetic engineering. The sudden appearance of symbolic thinking around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago is equally mysterious. This is when we start seeing cave art, carved figurines, musical instruments, complex tools with multiple components, burial goods suggesting belief in afterlife, and notation systems that might be early writing or counting. All of this requires abstract thinking, the ability to let one thing represent another thing. A carved figure represents an animal, A mark on bone represents a number. A burial with goods represents belief in continued existence. This level of symbolic thought requires language. You can't think abstractly without language to structure those thoughts. Language and abstract cognition are interlinked. They enable each other. So what happened 40,000 to 50,000 years ago that suddenly triggered this cognitive revolution? The environment wasn't changing dramatically. Brain size had already plateaued. Our ancestors had big brains for over 100,000 years before this. Anatomical capacity for speech had existed for even longer. Yet something triggered the activation of these capabilities. Some researchers call it the creative explosion, or the Great Leap Forward. It's like someone installed new software in the human brain, and boom, we could suddenly think in ways we couldn't before. We could plan, create, symbolize, remember, transmit knowledge across generations through stories and traditions. We became culturally capable, not just biologically modern. The ancient texts describe this as the gods giving wisdom, granting knowledge, opening the eyes of understanding. The Sumerian text Adapa and the South Wind describes how Enki gave wisdom to a human, making him wise like one of us. The Egyptian texts say Thoth gave the secrets of writing and calculation to humanity. The Prometheus myth has him stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans, but fire in mythology often symbolizes knowledge and enlightenment, not just literal combustion. What if these myths are describing the moment when abstract cognition, symbolic thinking, and complex language were activated in humanity? What if the gift was neurological activation, the turning on of capabilities that had been installed but not yet enabled? Language isolates are another linguistic mystery. These are languages that have no known relationship to any other language family. Basque in Europe is the famous example. It's completely unrelated to Indo-European, Uralic, or any other language group. It just sits there in the Pyrenees, linguistically unconnected to anything around it. Korean is another potential isolate. Sumerian was an isolate. It doesn't fit into any known language family despite being surrounded by Semitic languages. How do these languages exist? If language evolved and spread through human migration and contact, all languages should show some relationship to neighbouring languages, but isolates don't. They're orphans. They might represent survivor languages from before the diversification event, if there was one, or they might represent entirely different linguistic traditions introduced by different groups at different times. The distribution of language families is weird too. Indo-European languages spread from India to Iceland, covering massive geographic range. Yet some language families are incredibly localized, spoken by tiny populations in isolated regions. Why such uneven distribution? Standard linguistics explains this through migration and conquest, which is fair, but it doesn't explain why certain languages are so fundamentally different from their neighbours despite geographic proximity. It's almost like different populations receive different language packages at different times. The speed at which Creole languages develop is also telling. When you throw together people who speak different languages with no common tongue, they initially communicate through pidgin, simplified communication with no complex grammar. But within one generation, their children spontaneously develop full Creole languages with complete grammatical structures, even though their parents' pidgin didn't have those structures. The kids aren't learning it from adults, they're generating it themselves, creating grammar from scratch. This demonstrates that humans have an innate language generation capacity. We're hardwired to create complex language even when we're not exposed to it, which again suggests language capability is genetic, built in, not just cultural learning. But if this capability is genetic and universal, when did it get installed in the genome? Evolution requires gradual change over long periods with clear selective pressure. Language doesn't have obvious selective pressure in the evolutionary sense. Yes, communication helps survival, but simple communication systems work fine for that. Just ask chimps. Complex grammar, abstract thinking, and the ability to discuss philosophy don't make you better at hunting or avoiding predators. If anything, they waste metabolic energy on non-survival activities. Evolution should have selected against big energy expensive brains that spend time contemplating existence instead of finding food. Yet here we are, with brains that use massive amounts of energy to do things that don't obviously help us survive, unless survival wasn't the point, unless we were designed for something more than just survival. The ancient texts consistently describe humans being created for specific purposes, usually as workers, servants, or vessels for experiencing the physical world. But they also describe certain humans being granted additional wisdom and knowledge beyond their basic function. Enki giving wisdom to Adapa, Prometheus giving fire to humanity, Thoth teaching writing and science. These aren't stories about natural evolution. These are stories about intentional uplift, about taking a created species and upgrading it beyond its original specifications, and language would be the key to that upgrade. Because once you have complex language, you can transmit accumulated knowledge across generations. You can build on what previous generations learned. You can create civilization. You can go from surviving to thriving to eventually reaching for the stars yourself. Maybe that was the point. Maybe we weren't just created as permanent servants, but as a project with long-term potential. Create a species, give it basic capabilities, then later activate higher functions to see what it can do. An experiment in directed evolution. And language would be the crucial upgrade, the software patch that unlocked all the other capabilities. Once humans could speak, we could think abstractly, plan long-term, create art, develop technology, build civilizations. We could become something more than smart animals. We could become conscious beings capable of questioning our own existence. Which incidentally is exactly what we're doing right now. The evidence suggests language didn't evolve gradually. It appeared suddenly, was universally adopted, and fundamentally transformed human cognition in ways that still make linguists and evolutionary biologists uncomfortable. Every culture says it was a gift from the gods. Every language shares deep structural similarities suggesting common origin or design. The genetic basis appeared recently and rapidly. The activation of symbolic thinking happened in an evolutionary eye blink. And no other species on Earth shows even partial development of similar capabilities, despite millions of years of evolution. Either we won the cosmic lottery and random mutations just happened to give us complex language right when we needed it, with no intermediate steps and no other species even coming close. Or, and this should feel familiar by now, someone gave it to us. Someone who knew how to modify genetics to enable language. Someone who understood that language was the key to unlocking human potential. Someone who, according to every ancient culture on Earth, came from the sky and taught us to speak, think, and eventually build civilizations that would one day reach back toward the stars they came from. Your choice which explanation feels more likely. Alright, so we've talked about stories, genetics, artifacts, and language. Now let's talk about the really big stuff, literally. The structures that make modern engineers look at their degrees and wonder if they missed a class. Because scattered across the planet are architectural achievements that shouldn't exist. Massive stone structures built with precision that we struggle to replicate today, using tools that supposedly consisted of copper chisels and rope. And when you ask mainstream archaeology how ancient people achieved this, the answer basically amounts to, they were really determined and had lots of free time. Which is about as satisfying as explaining quantum physics with, stuff gets weird when it's small, technically true but missing some crucial details. Let's start with the big one, literally the biggest, the Great Pyramid of Giza. This thing is so precisely engineered that it makes modern construction look sloppy. We're talking about 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing up to 80 tons, stacked into a structure that was the tallest building on Earth for over 3,800 years. The base is level to within 2 centimeters across a 230-meter span. That's insane precision. Try leveling your kitchen floor to within 2 centimeters and see how that goes. Now do it with an area the size of multiple football fields using copper tools and no laser levels. The corners of the pyramid align almost perfectly with true north, south, east, and west, accurate to within 3/60 of a single degree. That's better than most buildings constructed today with GPS and computer-aided design. The blocks fit together so precisely that you can't slide a credit card between them in many places. No mortar, just stone on stone with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Some blocks weigh 70 to 80 tons and sit hundreds of feet up in the air. The standard explanation is ramps and manpower, thousands of workers pulling these massive stones up increasingly long ramps, which sounds plausible until you do the math. The ramp required to reach the pyramid's height would need to be over a mile long to maintain a workable slope. That ramp would contain more material than the pyramid itself. Where is it? Where's the evidence of this massive earthwork that would have been necessary? We have pyramids. We don't have mile-long ramps. That's a slight problem with the official story. Then there's the precision cutting. These aren't rough blocks chiseled into approximate shapes and stacked messily. These are precision-cut stones with perfectly flat surfaces, right angles that are actually right angles, and fitting so tight that the joints are nearly invisible. Modern stonemasons using power tools struggle to achieve this level of precision. But we're supposed to believe workers with copper chisels, copper, which is softer than the granite they were supposedly cutting, achieved tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Copper tools would be destroyed trying to cut granite. It's like trying to cut steel with aluminum foil. The physics don't work, yet the precision is there, undeniable, measurable. So either the ancient Egyptians had tools we don't know about, or they had help from someone who did. The astronomical alignments are equally problematic for the lucky primitives theory. The Great Pyramid's sides align with cardinal directions. The southern shaft in the King's Chamber points to where Orion's belt would have been in 2500 BC. The northern shaft points to the polar stars of that era. The dimensions of the pyramid encode mathematical constants like pi and phi. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height approximates 2 pi. The ratio of its height to half its base is phi, the golden ratio. Now, you could argue these are coincidences. Ancient builders just happened to stumble onto these mathematical relationships while trying to build a big pile of rocks. Or you could consider that maybe they knew exactly what they were doing because someone taught them advanced mathematics and astronomy. Someone who understood these constants and their significance. And let's not forget that according to mainstream chronology, this was built around 2500 BC by a civilization that supposedly didn't have wheels on a large scale, didn't have iron tools, and was working with copper and bronze. Yet they created a structure we couldn't replicate today without modern equipment. We literally cannot build a replica of the Great Pyramid using the tools and methods we claim they used. Multiple attempts by experimental archaeologists have failed to achieve anywhere near the same precision or scale. But sure, ancient Egyptians with copper tools and determination totally did it. Makes perfect sense. Just ignore the part where we can't actually demonstrate how. Now let's hop over to Baalbek in Lebanon, because this is where things get properly insane. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek sits on a foundation of massive stone blocks that make the Great Pyramid stones look like children's toys. We're talking about the trilithon, 3 stones that each weigh approximately 800 tons. 800 tons. That's 1.6 million pounds per stone. For context, the largest stones moved in modern construction rarely exceed 300 to 400 tons, and that requires specialized cranes, hydraulic equipment, and intensive planning. These 3 stones sit perfectly fitted together in a foundation wall, each one precisely cut and positioned. But wait, it gets better. Nearby in the quarry is an even larger stone called the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing an estimated 1,000 tons. It's cut, shaped, and ready for transport but never moved to the building site. Next to it is another stone estimated at 1,200 tons. These aren't rough-hewn boulders. They're precisely shaped rectangular blocks with smooth surfaces and right angles. Someone cut these monsters out of solid bedrock, shaped them to specification, and in the case of the trilithon, transported them half a mile and lifted them 20 feet into the air to place them in a wall. With what technology? Ramps and ropes? You'd need tens of thousands of people pulling in perfect coordination. The ropes would snap, the stones would crack, the logistics would be impossible. The official story is that the Romans built this temple on top of an earlier Phoenician foundation. Okay, fine, the Romans were excellent engineers, but even Roman engineering has limits. They built impressive aqueducts, roads, and buildings, but they didn't routinely move 800-ton stones. The largest stones in Roman construction elsewhere are maybe 50 to 100 tons, and those required special equipment and enormous effort. Yet at Baalbek they supposedly decided to work with stones 10 times larger for no apparent reason. And the foundation blocks show different construction techniques from the Roman temple above them, suggesting they're from different periods. The Roman stonework is impressive but conventional. The foundation blocks are megalithic and anomalous. 2 different technologies, 2 different time periods, but mainstream archaeology insists it's all Roman. Because admitting the foundation is far older and built with unknown techniques would raise uncomfortable questions about who was here before known civilizations. Let's fly to Bolivia and talk about Pumapunku, because this site breaks all the rules. Pumapunku is part of the Tiahuanaco complex, dated to around 500 to 600 AD, though some researchers argue it's far older. The site consists of precisely cut andesite and diorite blocks, some of the hardest stones on Earth. These blocks have perfectly flat surfaces, precise right angles, and interlocking joints that fit together like Lego pieces. Some blocks have H-shaped grooves cut into them with such precision that they look machined. The tolerances are measured in fractions of millimeters. The surfaces are so smooth and flat that they appear polished. Here's the problem. Andesite and diorite are igneous rocks with a Mohs hardness of 6 to 7. You can't cut them with copper or bronze tools. You need harder materials, diamond-tip tools or advanced abrasives. Modern stonemasons use diamond-edge power saws and precision grinders to work these stones. Yet at Pumapunku, we're told people in 500 AD, working with basic tools and no written language, created precision-cut blocks with perfectly flat surfaces, exact right angles, and complex interlocking joints. Some blocks have grooves and channels cut into them that would require advanced machining to achieve. We're talking about precision engineering that looks like it came from a factory, not a Stone Age workshop. The blocks also show signs of being part of a modular system. They have standardized dimensions and interlocking features that suggest they were mass-produced to a template. This isn't artisan stonework where each piece is unique. This is industrial production, blocks cut to specific measurements that fit together in predetermined ways, which implies planning, engineering, and manufacturing capabilities far beyond what we attribute to pre-Columbian South American cultures. The standard explanation is that they use stone hammers and abrasives, pounding away for months or years on each block, which doesn't explain the precision, the standardization, or the sheer number of perfectly cut blocks. It also doesn't explain how they cut the internal grooves and channels, some of which are only accessible from angles that would require removing material you can't reach with hand tools. The transport question at Pumapunku is equally baffling. Some blocks weigh over 100 tons. The nearest quarry for these stones is 10 miles away across difficult terrain. How did they move 100-ton blocks 10 miles without wheels, without animals capable of pulling such weight? Llamas max out at carrying about 100 pounds, not 100 tons, and without roads designed for such loads. The official answer involves log rollers and thousands of workers, but logs would be crushed under 100 tons. The terrain is mountainous and uneven. And again, no evidence of the massive infrastructure required for such an operation. No roads, no ramps, no support structures. The stones are just there, precisely cut and positioned, with no clear explanation for how they arrived. Now let's go back even further in time to Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, because this site rewrites everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Göbekli Tepe dates to around 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago, making it older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and older than the pyramids by 7,000 years. It was built at a time when humans were supposedly nomadic hunter-gatherers who hadn't invented agriculture, hadn't developed cities, and were basically just trying not to get eaten by predators. Yet somehow these supposedly primitive people organized the labor to quarry, transport, and erect massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved them with intricate reliefs of animals and symbols, and arranged them in circular structures, with astronomical alignments. Think about what mainstream archaeology is claiming here. Nomadic hunter-gatherers, with no permanent settlements, no social hierarchy complex enough to organize large-scale labor, and no agricultural surplus to feed workers, somehow decided to build a massive ceremonial complex requiring thousands of hours of skilled labor. They quarried and moved 20-ton stones, carved detailed reliefs into them, erected them in precise circular arrangements, and then, here's the weird part, they deliberately buried the entire site around 8000 BC, not abandoned, not destroyed, buried. Someone filled in the structures with rubble and dirt, preserving them but making them inaccessible. Why would you build something that's sophisticated and then bury it? The carvings at Göbekli Tepe show detailed knowledge of animals, including species that weren't native to the region. The astronomical alignments suggest understanding of celestial movements and the precession of the equinoxes. The organization required to build the site implies social complexity we don't associate with hunter-gatherer bands. Either everything we think we know about the development of human civilization is wrong, or Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by primitive hunter-gatherers. Maybe it was built by a more advanced culture that existed before the one we recognize as the first civilization. Or maybe it was built with guidance from teachers who knew how to organize large-scale construction projects and had the engineering knowledge to make it happen. The pattern across all these sites is consistent. Precision we can't explain, logistics we can't replicate, and methods we don't understand. The Great Pyramid's mathematical encoding and astronomical alignments. Baalbek's impossibly large foundation stones. Pumapunku's machine-like precision. Göbekli Tepe's sophistication in an era of supposed primitiveness. All of them demonstrate capabilities that don't match the technology we claim was available at the time. And all of them have local legends attributing their construction to gods, giants, or powerful beings from the sky who possessed knowledge beyond humans. The Egyptian texts say the gods taught them how to build. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki directing the construction of cities. The Inca, when asked about structures like Sacsayhuaman, said they didn't build them, the gods did, or an earlier civilization with powers the Inca didn't possess. Bolivian legends say Pumapunku was built by the gods in a single night. Turkish legends about Göbekli Tepe's region mention divine beings and celestial teachers. If these were just myths, why do they consistently attribute construction to non-human intelligence? Maybe because that's what actually happened. Maybe the stories aren't mythology. Maybe they're history. Modern attempts to explain these sites rely on theoretical techniques that haven't been demonstrated to work at the required scale and precision. We theorize about ramps, log rollers, and thousands of workers, but we can't actually show these methods achieving the results we see. Experimental archaeology tries to replicate ancient techniques and consistently falls short. We can move big stones, sure, but not with the precision, not at the scale, and not with the efficiency these ancient sites demonstrate. Which means either ancient people had techniques we've lost, possible but raises the question of why such useful technology would disappear, or they had help we haven't acknowledged. Here's the thing that bothers me most. We assume ancient people were less intelligent than us because they lived thousands of years ago. But intelligence hasn't changed. Human brains 10,000 years ago were the same as human brains today. If anything, people back then might have been sharper, no smartphones to do their thinking for them. So when we find precision engineering and mathematical encoding in ancient structures, maybe we shouldn't assume they stumbled onto it by accident. Maybe they knew exactly what they were doing because they were taught by someone who understood advanced mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. Someone who had the technology to cut 800-ton stones and lift them into place. Someone who could teach construction techniques we've since forgotten or never fully understood in the first place. The megalithic sites aren't just impressive, they're evidence. Evidence of capabilities that shouldn't exist in the time periods we assign them to. Evidence of knowledge that took us thousands of years to rediscover. Evidence of precision we still struggle to replicate. And when you combine them with the other evidence we've been stacking up, the global myths, the genetic anomalies, the linguistic revolution, the astronomical knowledge, the picture becomes clear. These weren't just really determined people with copper tools and time on their hands. These were people working with knowledge and possibly technology provided by teachers who came from somewhere else. The same teachers described in every ancient text, the same visitors depicted in rock art across the planet, the same sky gods credited with giving humanity civilization itself. The stones are there. The precision is measurable. The mathematics is encoded. The astronomy is aligned. And no amount of "they used ramps and rope" explains stones cut to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters or 800-ton blocks fitted perfectly into foundations. At some point, repeating the official story becomes less like science and more like dogma, less like evidence-based reasoning and more like refusing to consider alternatives because they're uncomfortable. And maybe that's the real mystery here. Not how these structures were built, but why we're so resistant to considering that the ancient world had help from sources we've been taught not to take seriously. We've covered the physical evidence, the genetic tampering, the impossible architecture. But now we need to talk about something that makes materialist scientists extremely uncomfortable. Consciousness. Specifically, what happens when you alter it. Because there's a pattern in shamanic traditions across the globe that's just as consistent as the visitor myths we discussed earlier. Shamans from cultures separated by oceans and millennia, who never contacted each other, report meeting the same beings in altered states of consciousness, the same entities, the same descriptions, the same messages. And before you write this off as drug-induced hallucinations, consider that we're talking about detailed, consistent accounts across thousands of years and multiple continents. When that many people independently describe the same experience, maybe, just maybe, they're experiencing something real, even if it exists in a domain we don't fully understand yet. Let's start with Lascaux Cave in France, because this is where things get visually interesting. The Lascaux paintings date back about 17,000 years, created by Paleolithic humans who supposedly spent their days hunting and their nights trying not to freeze to death. Yet deep in these caves, they painted something bizarre: therianthropes. These are figures that combine human and animal features, human bodies with bird heads specifically, and they're not crude stick figures. These are detailed, intentional representations showing beings with human posture and proportions but avian heads, often depicted with what appear to be beaks and large eyes. Sound familiar? Because these 17,000-year-old French cave paintings look suspiciously like depictions of Egyptian god Thoth, who was shown as an ibis-headed humanoid. They also resemble descriptions of the Anunnaki, who according to Sumerian texts sometimes appeared with bird-like features or wore bird-headed ceremonial garments. Now, the standard archaeological explanation is that these therianthropes represent shamans in trance states, wearing masks or experiencing spiritual transformation. Which is partly true. Shamanic practices do involve symbolic transformation and communication with non-human entities. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. What if the shamans weren't imagining these entities? What if altered states of consciousness allowed them to perceive or communicate with actual beings that exist in dimensions or frequencies we normally can't access? What if shamanism isn't just symbolic ritual but a technology, a method of communication that works through consciousness rather than physical instruments? Indigenous shamanic traditions worldwide describe entering altered states through various methods: drumming, chanting, fasting, sensory deprivation, or in some cases, psychoactive plants. And consistently, across cultures, they report encountering similar entities. The Shipibo shamans of the Amazon describe geometric beings of light who teach them healing songs and show them the interconnectedness of all life. Native American vision quests involve encountering spirit guides and teachers, often with mixed human-animal features. Siberian shamans describe traveling to other realms and meeting powerful entities who grant knowledge and healing abilities. Australian Aboriginal shamans speak of the dream time, a parallel reality where they communicate with ancestral beings and learn sacred knowledge. The descriptions vary culturally, filtered through different languages and belief systems, but the core experience is remarkably consistent. Altered consciousness allows access to non-ordinary reality where intelligent entities exist and can communicate. What's particularly interesting is that these entities don't just appear, they teach. They provide information. Shamans across cultures credit their knowledge of medicinal plants, healing techniques, astronomical observations, and cultural practices to information received from entities encountered in altered states. The Amazonian shamans have encyclopedic knowledge of plant medicine. They can tell you which of thousands of plant species will cure specific ailments, how to prepare them, what dosages to use, and what combinations are synergistic or dangerous. When anthropologists ask how they know all this, the answer is consistent. The plants told us, or the spirits showed us. Which sounds like mystical nonsense until you realize they're describing precise biochemical information that we're only now confirming with modern pharmacology. They knew which plants contain compounds that affect specific neurotransmitter systems before we even knew neurotransmitters existed. How? The standard scientific dismissal is that they learned through trial and error over thousands of years, which doesn't actually make sense when you think about it. There are over 80,000 plant species in the Amazon rainforest. Testing them randomly for medicinal properties through trial and error would take hundreds of thousands of years and would kill a lot of experimenters in the process. Many medicinal preparations require specific combinations of plants, sometimes 3 or 4 different species that individually are inactive or toxic, but together produce therapeutic effects. The odds of discovering these combinations through random trial and error are astronomical. Yet indigenous shamans have this knowledge and consistently attribute it to communication with plant spirits or teaching entities encountered in altered states. Maybe we should take them at their word. Modern research into psychedelics is starting to validate some of these claims, which must be really awkward for scientists who've spent decades dismissing shamanic knowledge as superstition. Studies using DMT, a powerful psychedelic compound found naturally in certain plants and in the human brain, show that users consistently report encountering entities. Not vague feelings or abstract experiences, but what participants describe as meetings with intelligent beings who communicate through visual language, geometric patterns, or direct knowledge transfer. Participants from different backgrounds, cultures, and expectations report similar encounters. Entities described as machine elves, geometric beings, light beings, or alien intelligences appear across thousands of independent reports. The experiences are so consistent that researchers have started cataloguing entity types and interaction patterns. Now, materialist neuroscience tries to explain this as brain chemistry. DMT affects serotonin receptors, creates unusual neural activity patterns, and the brain interprets these patterns as entities. Which is technically true, but doesn't explain why everyone's brain independently creates the same entities with the same characteristics. If these were random hallucinations, you'd expect variation based on individual psychology, culture, and expectation. But you don't get that. You get consistent reports across demographics. People who've never heard of machine elves encounter machine elves. People with no knowledge of shamanic traditions describe entities and experiences that perfectly match accounts from indigenous practitioners. That's not individual brain chemistry. That's access to something shared, something external, something that exists independent of individual consciousness. Here's where it connects to our ancient alien hypothesis. What if altered states of consciousness allow contact with the same entities ancient cultures described as gods from the sky? What if consciousness operates on frequencies or in dimensions that don't require physical proximity? The entities shamans encounter often claim to be teachers, guides, or overseers of humanity. They provide knowledge, show patterns, and communicate information about reality, healing, and consciousness. This matches exactly what ancient texts say the sky gods did: came to Earth, taught humanity, granted knowledge. Maybe they're still here, still communicating, but now the contact happens through consciousness rather than physical appearance. Or maybe it always happened both ways: physical contact for practical teaching and building projects, and consciousness contact for knowledge transfer and ongoing guidance. The Vedic texts describe beings called devas, who exist in higher dimensions and can be contacted through meditation and altered states. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes encountering various entities during altered consciousness, particularly during death and rebirth transitions. These aren't presented as hallucinations, but as actual beings existing in non-physical realms. The ancient Egyptians believed Ka and Ba, aspects of soul and consciousness, could travel to other realms and communicate with gods. Mystery schools across ancient civilizations used techniques to induce altered states specifically for the purpose of encountering divine beings and receiving teachings. This wasn't recreational drug use or random shamanism. This was systematic methodology for consciousness-based communication. Now let's pivot to something that makes the shamanic stuff seem almost conventional by comparison. Modern science has been quietly confirming claims made in ancient texts that were dismissed as mythology for thousands of years. Remember how we talked about the Dogon knowing about Sirius B before Western astronomy? Well, in 1862 we confirmed Sirius B exists. In 1970 we photographed it. The Dogon were right. About an invisible star they had no telescopes to see, whose existence they attributed to amphibious beings from that star system who visited Earth. Mythology, or documented history that we finally have the technology to verify. The discovery of DNA's double helix structure in 1953 by Watson and Crick was hailed as a groundbreaking achievement. Except Sumerian cylinder seals from thousands of years ago depict intertwined serpents in a helical pattern. The caduceus symbol, two snakes wrapped around a staff, has been associated with healing and medicine for millennia. Ancient Indian texts describe the Kundalini as a coiled serpent of energy, with two intertwined channels called Ida and Pingala, shown in art as two intertwined serpents in a helical pattern. The Chinese depicted yin and yang as intertwined forces. Multiple ancient cultures depicted the fundamental structure of life as two intertwined spirals before we had any scientific concept of molecular biology. Coincidence? Or were they depicting knowledge that was given to them? The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes the creation of humans through a process that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering. The text talks about mixing the essence of a god with earthly matter, describes multiple failed attempts before success, and mentions creating humans to specific specifications for specific purposes. For thousands of years, this was read as mythological poetry. Then, in the 1950s, we discovered DNA and began genetic engineering. Now we can literally do what the Enuma Elish describes: take genetic material, modify it, combine it with other genetic material, create organisms to specification. Turns out the ancient text wasn't poetry, it was a procedure description. We just didn't have the scientific framework to recognize it until now. Ancient texts describe flying vehicles, the Vimanas in Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. These aren't vague, the gods flew in chariots descriptions. These are technical specifications. The Vaimanika Shastra describes different types of aircraft, their power sources, navigation systems, and operational procedures. It mentions pilots needing protective clothing for high-altitude flight. It describes weapons mounted on these craft that emit fire and light, capable of destroying targets at distance. It even mentions materials that would be invisible to enemy detection. For centuries, scholars read this as fantasy literature. Then we invented aircraft. Then we developed stealth technology. Then we built high-altitude suits and weapon systems. Suddenly, the ancient texts start sounding less like mythology and more like engineering manuals from a civilization we didn't know existed. The precision astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient structures and texts is another confirmation point. The Great Pyramid's alignment with true north, its encoding of the Earth's circumference in its dimensions, and its position relative to other pyramids mirroring Orion's belt, all this requires astronomical and mathematical knowledge, we thought, developed thousands of years later. The Mayan calendar system is more accurate than the Gregorian calendar we use today. They tracked Venus's cycles with precision that wasn't matched by European astronomy until the invention of telescopes. The Antikythera mechanism shows the Greeks built analog computers to calculate astronomical positions 2,000 years before we invented such devices. The knowledge was there. We just forgot it or never acknowledged it properly in our historical timelines. Modern exoplanet research is finding potentially habitable planets around other stars at an accelerating rate. We've identified thousands of exoplanets, hundreds in zones where liquid water could exist. We're detecting atmospheric compositions that might indicate biological activity. We're finding that planetary systems are common, not rare. Which means the ancient texts claiming beings came from other star systems aren't automatically implausible. If planets are common and potentially habitable planets exist throughout the galaxy, then the development of intelligent life elsewhere isn't a wild fantasy. It's a statistical probability. The ancient accounts of visitors from the stars stop looking like mythology and start looking like historical documentation when you realize the stars they pointed to actually could have planetary systems capable of supporting advanced civilizations. The convergence between ancient knowledge and modern scientific discovery is getting impossible to ignore. Ancient cultures knew things they shouldn't have been able to know with the technology we credit them with. They described processes we've only recently developed the ability to perform ourselves. They depicted structures we've only recently discovered. They claimed contact with beings from the stars at a time when we're confirming that other stars have planets that could support life. At some point you have to ask, how did they know? Where did this knowledge come from? The standard academic response is that ancient people were smarter than we give them credit for and figured things out through observation and reasoning. Which is partly true. Ancient people were indeed brilliant and made remarkable discoveries through systematic observation. But there's a difference between observing the night sky and deducing that a particular star has an invisible companion star with specific physical properties. There's a difference between understanding human anatomy through dissection and depicting the molecular structure of DNA in your art. There's a difference between inventing basic tools and describing high-altitude aircraft with advanced propulsion systems. Some knowledge gaps are too large to bridge through observation alone. Sometimes you need someone to tell you. Someone who already knows. The shamanic experiences, the ancient texts, the archaeological anomalies, the genetic mysteries, the astronomical knowledge, the architectural achievements, they're all pointing the same direction. Toward contact. Toward teaching. Toward intervention by intelligences that possessed advanced knowledge and shared it with humanity in ways we're only now beginning to understand. The shamans say they still make contact through altered states. The ancient texts say the gods taught and left. Modern science keeps confirming claims made in texts we thought were pure mythology. The pattern is there. The evidence is accumulating. And the more we discover, the more the ancient accounts stop looking like primitive superstition and start looking like the most important history we've been systematically ignoring because it doesn't fit our preferred narrative about human development. Whether the contact was physical, consciousness-based, or both, whether it's ongoing or historical, whether the entities are extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something we don't have categories for yet, these are open questions. But pretending contact didn't happen because it challenges our assumptions, that's not science, that's denial. And denial doesn't change what's carved in stone, encoded in genes, depicted in caves, and confirmed by our own advancing technology. The ancients knew, they tried to tell us, we just weren't listening, until maybe now. All right, we've been on quite a journey here. We've covered global myths, genetic anomalies, impossible artifacts, architectural marvels, linguistic mysteries, shamanic contacts, and scientific confirmations of ancient knowledge. Now it's time to step back and look at the whole picture. Because individually, each piece of evidence can be explained away, dismissed, or attributed to coincidence. But when you stack them all together, when you see how they interconnect and support each other, a coherent theory emerges. Not a wild conspiracy theory, but an actual testable hypothesis based on accumulated evidence. So let's systematically build the case for what researchers call the ancient astronaut theory, or paleo-contact hypothesis, the idea that Earth has been visited by extraterrestrial intelligences who directly influenced human development. First, let's talk about motivation. Why would an advanced civilization bother visiting Earth? What's in it for them? The Sumerian texts are surprisingly explicit about this. Resources, specifically gold. The Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, which they needed to repair or protect the atmosphere of their home planet. Now, before you laugh that off as absurd mythology, consider that modern science actually supports the plausibility of this. Gold is an excellent reflector of radiation and heat. It's used in spacecraft heat shields and in satellite components for radiation protection. In theory, dispersing gold particles in an atmosphere could create a protective layer against solar radiation, or help stabilize atmospheric temperature. It's not mythology. It's applied materials science, just described in terms an ancient culture could understand. Earth has abundant gold deposits, particularly in Africa. And here's where it gets interesting. Ancient mines in South Africa date back over 100,000 years. That's not a typo. Mines that are older than any known civilization, older than modern humans, were supposedly capable of organized mining operations. Who was mining there? The standard explanation is early humans, but early humans 100,000 years ago were supposed to be hunter-gatherers without complex tools or social organization necessary for large-scale mining. Yet the mines exist. Deep mines requiring serious excavation effort, targeting specific mineral deposits. Someone was mining gold in Africa at a time when, according to conventional history, nobody should have been capable of it. Unless, of course, someone else was running the operation and using local hominids as labor, exactly what the Sumerian texts describe. Beyond resource extraction, there's the scientific motivation. If you're an advanced civilization exploring the galaxy, Earth would be fascinating. A planet with diverse ecosystems, abundant life, and a biosphere that's been evolving for billions of years would be of enormous scientific interest. You'd want to study it, catalogue it, possibly experiment with it. The genetic engineering we discussed earlier, the sudden leap in human cognitive abilities, the mysterious genes that don't match any evolutionary ancestors, the modifications that gave us language and abstract thought, these could be scientific experiments. Take the local hominid species, upgrade their cognitive capabilities, see what happens. It's what we do with lab animals now. We genetically modify mice to study disease and development. An advanced civilization might genetically modify hominids to study intelligence and consciousness. Not malicious, just scientific curiosity combined with practical utility. Create a workforce that can follow complex instructions while you're mining resources, and also study the emergence of intelligence in a modified species. 2 birds, 1 stone. Now let's talk about methods of contact. The evidence suggests multiple forms of interaction. Physical presence is documented in texts, artifacts, and architecture. The megalithic structures we discussed, pyramids, Baalbek, Pumapunku, these required on-site guidance at minimum. Someone was there physically, directing construction, teaching techniques, possibly even providing technology or direct assistance. The precision cutting, the massive stone movement, the astronomical alignments, these weren't done through telepathic instructions. Someone with physical tools and knowledge was present. But there's also evidence of non-physical contact, particularly through consciousness. The shamanic experiences, the consistent encounters with entities in altered states, the knowledge transfer that happens through visions and dreams, this suggests communication that doesn't require physical proximity. Maybe it's telepathic, maybe it's dimensional, maybe it's technological in ways we don't understand yet. But the consistency of these experiences across cultures and time periods suggests they're accessing something real, even if that something exists in a domain our current physics doesn't adequately describe. If consciousness is non-local, if it exists beyond the physical brain, then contact through consciousness becomes not mystical but practical. Why physically visit when you can communicate directly through consciousness? Especially if you've already modified the species to be receptive to such communication. The legacy they left behind is multifaceted. Genetically, we've got the engineered upgrades, the brain expansion, the FOXP2 language gene, the 223 mysterious genes that appear in humans but no other species, the cognitive capabilities that serve no obvious evolutionary purpose. These are permanent modifications encoded in our DNA passed down through every generation. We're walking evidence of genetic intervention. Technologically, they left knowledge, astronomical data that took us thousands of years to rediscover. Mathematical concepts encoded in ancient structures, medical knowledge that modern pharmacology is only now validating, engineering techniques we still can't fully replicate. This knowledge wasn't discovered through trial and error, it was taught. The ancient texts explicitly say so. The gods taught agriculture, metallurgy, mathematics, writing, astronomy, medicine. They didn't inspire humans to figure it out themselves, they directly transmitted information. And that information, passed down through cultural traditions and encoded in monuments, has shaped human civilization ever since. Architecturally, the megalithic sites serve multiple purposes. They're markers, demonstrating the presence of advanced knowledge. They're teaching tools, encoding astronomical and mathematical information for future generations. They're possibly functional. Some researchers argue the pyramids served purposes beyond tombs, possibly as power generation or communication devices. The precision and effort involved suggest they weren't just monuments to dead kings, but installations with specific functions we've forgotten or never understood, and they're durable. These structures have lasted thousands of years and will likely last thousands more. If you wanted to leave evidence of your presence that would survive catastrophes and the rise and fall of civilizations, massive stone structures precisely aligned with astronomical constants would be an excellent choice. Now the difficult question, why did the contact stop? Or did it? The texts suggest a phased withdrawal. The Sumerian accounts describe the Anunnaki leaving after the flood, with kingship being lowered from heaven to human rulers who would govern independently. Egyptian texts describe the time of the gods ending and the time of human pharaohs beginning. Greek mythology has the Titan Age ending and gods withdrawing from direct interaction with humans. Hindu texts describe ages of the gods followed by ages of lesser beings, and eventually the current age where divine interaction is minimal. The pattern across cultures is consistent. There was a time of direct contact, then a withdrawal to indirect influence, then eventually near-complete absence. Why withdraw? Several possibilities. Maybe the project was complete. They genetically engineered a species capable of eventually developing civilization on its own. They'd provided enough knowledge to bootstrap development, and now it was time to let the experiment run without interference to see what would happen. Like scientists observing a study, you set up the conditions, introduce the variables, then minimize interference to observe natural outcomes. Too much intervention would contaminate the results, or maybe the withdrawal was strategic. Direct contact with a vastly superior civilization could stunt the development of the lesser one. If every time humans faced a challenge, advanced beings showed up to solve it, humans would never develop problem-solving capabilities, technological innovation, or independence. By withdrawing, they forced humanity to develop on its own, using the knowledge and capabilities that had been provided as foundation rather than crutch. It's parenting strategy on a civilization scale. Teach your children, give them tools, then step back and let them figure things out, intervening only in extreme circumstances. There's also the possibility that contact didn't stop but changed forms. Maybe physical visits became less frequent while consciousness-based contact continued. The shamanic traditions suggest ongoing communication through altered states. Some UFO phenomena could be continuing monitoring or intervention, just more subtle and less openly acknowledged than in ancient times. If the goal is observation without interference, occasional brief contacts and monitoring from a distance would make sense. The timeline of contact is complicated by contradictory evidence. Some artifacts and mining operations suggest visitation millions of years ago. The Klerksdorp spheres in 2.8 billion-year-old rock, ancient mining operations over 100,000 years old. This could indicate multiple species visiting at different times, or one species conducting long-term operations and monitoring over vast time spans. The genetic evidence suggests intervention around 200,000 years ago when modern humans appeared, with another intervention around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago when cognitive capabilities were activated. The megalithic construction boom happened between 12,000 and 2,500 BC, suggesting intensive contact during this period. The detailed texts describing the gods come from Sumerian civilization around 4,000 to 3,000 BC, with similar accounts in Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica from similar time periods. This suggests a timeline something like initial observation and possibly resource extraction millions of years ago, genetic engineering of hominids around 200,000 years ago, activation of language and cognitive abilities 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, intensive contact and civilization building assistance from 12,000 to 3,000 BC, then gradual withdrawal with decreasing direct contact over the last 3,000 years. But these are rough estimates based on fragmentary evidence. The actual timeline could be far more complex with multiple visits, different groups, different agendas. The impact on human civilization is total. Everything we attribute to human ingenuity might be, at least partially, the result of transmitted knowledge. Agriculture, the foundation of civilization, appears suddenly in multiple locations around 10,000 BC. Not a gradual discovery, but a rapid adoption of domesticated crops and animals that allowed population growth and settled communities. The crops themselves show genetic evidence of intentional selection and possibly modification that would have taken thousands of years to achieve through natural selective breeding. Yet they appear relatively quickly in the archaeological record. Writing systems appear suddenly in Sumer, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica, with no clear developmental progression from simple to complex. They emerge fully formed with grammar, syntax, and thousands of characters or symbols. Mathematics appears with advanced concepts. The Sumerians had base 60 mathematics, which is more sophisticated than our base 10 system, and still used for measuring time and angles. Astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, architecture, all appear with foundational knowledge already in place, then develop further through human effort and observation. Without this transmitted knowledge, would humans have developed civilization at all? Maybe eventually, through pure trial and error over hundreds of thousands of years. But the rapid development we see, from cave paintings to cities in just a few thousand years, suggests a significant head start. We didn't build civilization from scratch, we built it on a foundation that was given to us. And that foundation included not just practical knowledge but conceptual frameworks, the idea that the universe operates on mathematical principles, that observation and reason can unlock natural laws, that organization and cooperation can achieve monumental results. These aren't obvious concepts. Many species are intelligent but never develop these frameworks. We developed them, or had them installed, remarkably quickly. The theory then is this. Earth was visited by one or more advanced extraterrestrial civilizations over a period spanning possibly millions of years, with intensive contact between approximately 200,000 and 3,000 years ago. These visitors had multiple motivations, including resource extraction, scientific research, and possibly long-term experimentation with directed evolution and civilization development. They genetically modified existing hominid species to create modern humans with enhanced cognitive capabilities. They transmitted foundational knowledge in agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and other fields that allowed rapid civilization development. They directed or assisted in the construction of megalithic monuments that served as markers, teaching tools, and possibly functional installations. Then they gradually withdrew from direct contact, leaving humanity to develop independently using the knowledge and capabilities that had been provided. Contact may continue in limited forms through consciousness interaction and possible subtle monitoring. This theory explains the genetic anomalies we can't otherwise account for. It explains the sudden appearance of complex capabilities like language and symbolic thinking. It explains the impossible precision of ancient architecture and the advanced knowledge encoded in ancient texts. It explains the global consistency of visitor myths and the detailed accounts of contact in multiple cultures. It explains why modern science keeps confirming claims in ancient texts we thought were pure mythology. And it provides a coherent framework for understanding human history that's actually more scientifically plausible than the standard narrative of isolated primitives independently developing identical myths, inexplicably acquiring knowledge they had. No means of discovering and somehow building structures we can't replicate today. Is this theory proven? No, science doesn't prove. It supports or fails to support through evidence, and the evidence supporting paleocontact is substantial and growing. Is it the only possible explanation? No. But it's a better explanation than coincidence, collective hallucination, and they were just really determined. At minimum, it deserves serious scientific investigation rather than reflexive dismissal. Because if it's correct, if contact actually happened, then everything we think we know about human history, human origins, and our place in the universe needs revision. And that's not a flaw in the theory. That's why the theory matters. So here we are at the end of this journey, and if you've made it this far, you're probably either convinced, deeply skeptical, or somewhere in that uncomfortable middle ground where the evidence is too substantial to dismiss, but the implications are too massive to fully accept. And honestly, that middle ground is probably the healthiest place to be, because what we're talking about here isn't just ancient history, it's identity. It's the fundamental question of who and what we are as a species. Let's be clear about what accepting the paleocontact hypothesis would mean. It would mean that humans are not the crown of creation, not the pinnacle of evolution, not the universe's lucky accident that achieved consciousness through random chance and natural selection. We're a project, an experiment. A species that was deliberately created, modified, and guided by intelligences from elsewhere. Our DNA was engineered, our cognitive abilities were installed. Our early civilizations were jump-started with transmitted knowledge and possibly direct assistance. We're not self-made, we're cultivated. And depending on your perspective, that's either the most humbling or the most exciting realization possible. For religion, this is complicated. The major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, describe God creating humans in his image, breathing life into us, granting us dominion over earth. Now, you could argue that the Anunnaki, or whoever did the engineering, were the gods these texts reference. The biblical account of the Nephilim, giants who were offspring of sons of God and human women, could be describing hybrid offspring of extraterrestrials and humans. The concept of God creating humans from clay could be metaphorical language for genetic engineering using earthly biological material. Religious texts might not be contradicted by paleocontact theory. They might be cultural interpretations of actual events involving advanced beings who were perceived as divine. But this requires rethinking what divine means. If the creators were flesh and blood extraterrestrials with advanced technology, rather than omnipotent supernatural beings, then worship might be misplaced. Though arguably, if they designed our genetics, gave us consciousness, and provided the knowledge that enabled civilization, they certainly merit respect and gratitude even if they're not gods in the traditional sense. The question becomes, are we worshipping creators who are actually advanced biological entities, or is there still a higher divine power that created them and us? The paleocontact hypothesis doesn't necessarily eliminate God, it might just add layers to the creation story. For philosophy and existentialism, this is huge. The question, why are we here, has traditionally been answered either through religion, divine purpose, or through atheistic existentialism. No inherent purpose, we create our own meaning. But paleocontact offers a third option. We were created for a purpose, but that purpose was defined by other beings, not by ultimate divine will or by ourselves. We're a project that might have specific intended functions, workers, experiments, vessels for experiencing physical reality, or something else entirely. Does knowing we were designed for a purpose obligate us to fulfill that purpose? Or having achieved consciousness and independence, Are we free to define our own meaning regardless of original intent? It's a philosophical question without clear answers. For science, accepting paleo contact would require major revisions but wouldn't invalidate the scientific method. Evolution still happened, we just need to add with occasional directed intervention to the natural selection process. Genetics remains valid. We just acknowledge that some genetic changes were introduced rather than random mutations. Physics, chemistry, biology, all remain operational. We just need to expand our historical framework to include contact with advanced non-human intelligence. Science has adapted to paradigm shifts before: heliocentrism, evolution, relativity, quantum mechanics. This would be another one. Difficult, controversial, but ultimately manageable if the evidence continues accumulating. The psychological impact on humanity would be profound. For better or worse, humans have seen ourselves as special, the only intelligent species on our planet, possibly the only intelligence in the universe. Learning we're not alone, that we never were alone, that we're actually the created rather than the creators, that our entire civilization is built on a foundation we didn't independently develop. This challenges our collective ego in fundamental ways. Some people would find this devastating, a destruction of human achievement and dignity. Others would find it liberating, an expansion of our understanding and our place in a larger cosmic community. There's also the question of what comes next. If contact happened in the past, could it happen again? Are we being monitored? Will the creators return to check on their project? The ancient texts, interestingly, often include promises of return. The gods who left said they would come back. Religious traditions speak of a second coming, a return of divine beings or messiahs who will judge or guide humanity. What if these aren't metaphorical prophecies but actual plans? What if the creators intend to return at some point to evaluate how their experiment turned out? This is where it gets both exciting and terrifying, because by any objective measure, we're not doing great. We've got the knowledge they gave us: mathematics, astronomy, engineering, medicine. We've built on that foundation and developed technologies they might not have anticipated we'd achieve so quickly. We've got nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, space travel capabilities. We've done remarkable things. But we've also got war, environmental destruction, inequality, and a disturbing tendency to use our knowledge for harm as often as for good. If the creators showed up for an evaluation, would we pass? Or would they decide the experiment failed and it's time to start over with a better design? The possibility of renewed contact raises questions about how we should prepare. Do we try to make contact ourselves through SETI or other programs? Do we assume they're already watching and adjust our behavior accordingly? Do we continue developing independently and hope that demonstrating self-sufficiency impresses our creators more than obedience would? There's no roadmap for this. We've spent thousands of years pretending we're alone, building civilizations and philosophies based on that assumption. Shifting to a framework where we acknowledge we're not alone, we never were, and our creators might show up any time to see how we're doing, that requires fundamentally different thinking. One practical consideration: if contact happened before, the evidence is in the archaeology, the texts, the genetics, the structures. Which means we should be studying these things more seriously, not dismissing them because they don't fit our preferred narrative. Every ancient text claiming divine contact should be examined for possible historical content. Every anomalous artifact should be tested rigorously rather than shelved. Every genetic mystery should be investigated fully, because understanding our true history isn't just academic, it's existential. Knowing where we came from, how we got here, what we were designed for, and whether the designers are still watching could be the most important knowledge humanity could acquire. There's also the question of other contact. If Earth was visited and modified, were other planets? Are there other species out there that were similarly engineered or contacted? Are we part of a larger program, multiple species on multiple worlds all being developed simultaneously? The scale of the universe suggests there should be other intelligent life. The Fermi paradox asks why we haven't detected any if it's so probable. But maybe we have detected it, or rather its traces. Maybe the ancient astronaut phenomena on Earth is just our local instance of a galaxy-wide process of directed development. Maybe we're not looking at Earth-specific anomalies, but at evidence of a systematic approach to seeding intelligence throughout the galaxy. This gets into some wild speculation. But if the evidence supports even a fraction of the paleo-contact hypothesis, then wild speculation becomes reasonable theorizing. Because if contact happened once, if genetic engineering happened, if knowledge was transmitted, then the universe is far more populated and interactive than our current paradigm acknowledges. We're not looking at an empty universe where intelligence evolved once by accident on one small planet. We're looking at a cosmos where intelligence is possibly common, where advanced civilizations travel between stars, where genetic engineering and directed evolution are tools used to spread and develop consciousness throughout the galaxy. For humanity's future, understanding our past matters immensely. If we're heading toward becoming an interstellar civilization ourselves, and our current trajectory suggests we are, assuming we survive our teenage phase of nuclear weapons and climate change, then knowing we had help getting started changes how we approach our own development. Do we pay it forward? When we develop the capability to visit other worlds with less advanced species, do we help them as we were helped? Do we follow the same model, genetic modification, knowledge transfer, then withdrawal to let them develop independently? Or do we take a different approach based on what we've learned from our own experience? There's a deeper question too. If we were created with specific purposes, but we've now achieved independence and self-direction, what are our obligations? Do we owe our creators anything? Service, obedience, gratitude? Or having been given consciousness and free will, are we now autonomous entities responsible only to ourselves? It's the same question adopted children face about biological parents, or AI might someday face about human creators. What do you owe to someone who made you but isn't part of your daily existence? And perhaps most importantly, knowing we were designed potentially as workers or experiments, how do we claim dignity and worth? The standard humanist argument for human value is based on our unique consciousness, our capacity for reason and creativity, our moral agency. But if these capabilities were installed by creators for their purposes, does that diminish their value? I'd argue no. A designed intelligence is still intelligence. A created consciousness still experiences, thinks, feels, and chooses. The fact that our existence was intentional rather than accidental doesn't make it less meaningful. If anything, being designed suggests we have purpose built in, which some philosophies would consider more meaningful than random existence. The path forward requires balancing several things, continuing to investigate the evidence without prejudice or predetermined conclusions, remaining open to radical revisions of our historical understanding if data supports them, preparing, psychologically and philosophically, for the possibility that contact could resume, and building our civilization in ways that would make us worthy partners in a galactic community, rather than embarrassing failures of a genetic experiment. Because here's the ultimate point. Whether or not the paleo-contact hypothesis is correct, thinking about it, investigating it, and grappling with its implications makes us better scientists, better philosophers, and maybe better humans. It forces us to question assumptions, to look at evidence we've been ignoring, to consider possibilities we've been dismissing. Science progresses not by defending established narratives, but by challenging them, testing them, and revising them when evidence demands it. And the evidence we've been accumulating, all the pieces we've discussed throughout this journey, demands serious consideration. So where does that leave us? Standing on a planet that might have been visited and modified by advanced intelligences, carrying DNA that might include engineered upgrades, using knowledge that might have been transmitted rather than discovered, building on a foundation we didn't entirely lay ourselves, looking at monuments we can't fully explain, and texts that describe events we've called mythology but might be history, and wondering whether our creators are still watching, still caring, still planning to return. It's unsettling, it's exciting, it's humbling, it's terrifying. It's exactly the kind of uncertainty that drives both scientific investigation and existential anxiety. But it's also potentially the most important question we could be asking. Are we alone, or were we never alone to begin with? The evidence suggests an answer. The structures stand, the texts remain, the genes persist, the knowledge endures. All pointing toward contact, toward intervention, toward a history more complex and more cosmic than we've been taught. Whether that history becomes accepted science or remains controversial theory depends on whether we're brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to conclusions that challenge everything we thought we knew about ourselves. We might be the children of the stars, not metaphorically but literally, designed, taught, and guided by beings who came from out there and left their mark in our DNA, our monuments, and our myths. If that's true, then understanding it isn't just about rewriting history textbooks. It's about understanding who we are, why we're here, and what we might become. And that's worth investigating, worth considering, worth taking seriously, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Because in the end, truth is more valuable than comfort. Understanding is more important than maintaining convenient narratives. And if our creators are still out there, still watching, still waiting to see what we become, then maybe we should make sure we become something worthy of their effort. Something that justifies the engineering, the teaching, the investment. Not because we owe them obedience, but because we owe ourselves excellence. We were given a foundation. What we build on it is up to us. And that ultimately is both the burden and the gift of being human, created perhaps, but now creating our own future, for better or worse, among the stars.